Welcome to Her True Stories, the home of raw, passionate stories of revenge. Before we dive into this unbelievable true story of betrayal, secrets, and revenge spanning decades, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when a mother's patience meets a son's cruelty. This story will have you questioning everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and the price of justice. My name is Catherine Woods, and at 58, I've learned that the deepest cuts come from those who are supposed to love you most. The digital invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, slipping into my inbox like a knife between the ribs. I was having my morning coffee in the sunroom of my modest two-bedroom apartment in Cambridge, watching the rain streak down the windows and listening to the gentle hum of traffic beginning the workday rush. It was my favorite time of day. Quiet, peaceful, with the whole world still full of possibilities. My phone chimed with the notification, and I set down my ceramic mug, a gift from Ethan during his sophomore year at Harvard, back when he still called me Mom, instead of avoiding my calls entirely. The sender was listed as Ethan Woods, and my heart did that little flutter it always did when I heard from my son, even though our communications had become increasingly rare and cold over the past 5 years. You are cordially invited to celebrate the graduation of Ethan Woods from Harvard Business School, the elegant script announced. Join us for an evening of celebration as we honor this remarkable achievement. For a moment, just a moment, I felt pure, undiluted joy flood through my chest. My son, my brilliant, beautiful boy, had graduated from Harvard Business School. Despite everything we'd been through, despite the poverty and struggle and sacrifice that had defined his childhood, he'd made it to the absolute pinnacle of academic achievement. I found myself smiling through sudden tears, remembering the little boy who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read to him from library books, who would help me count coins at the kitchen table to see if we had enough for groceries that week, who had promised me when he was 8 years old that someday he would make enough money so Mommy never has to work 3 jobs again. He'd done it, against all odds, through sheer determination and intelligence and the foundation I'd tried to give him. He'd accomplished something extraordinary. But then I scrolled down to read the personal message attached to the formal invitation, and the warmth in my chest turned to ice so quickly that I actually gasped out loud. Please don't embarrass me, Mom. Just be quiet. Stay near the back. Please don't sit near my guests. You disgust me. You have since day one. Try not to ruin this for me like you've ruined everything else. I read the words 3 times, my hands beginning to tremble so violently that I nearly dropped the phone. Not from shock, God help me. I'd been receiving messages like this from my son for the past 5 years, ever since Richard Morrison had slithered back into our lives like a serpent in an expensive suit. But the casual cruelty of it, the calculated dismissal, the sheer venom in those carefully chosen words still had the power to take my breath away. You disgust me. You have since day one. Try not to ruin this for me like you've ruined everything else. I set the phone down with exaggerated care, as if it were made of glass, and walked to my bathroom mirror on unsteady legs. I needed to see the reflection that apparently filled my son with such revulsion, the face that had become so repugnant to him that he couldn't bear the thought of his Harvard friends seeing me in anything but the darkest corner of whatever elegant venue he'd chosen for his celebration. At 58, I was still beautiful, not in the fresh, dewy way of youth, but in the deeper, more complex way of a woman who had lived fully and learned hard lessons. My silver hair fell in soft waves past my shoulders, catching the light from the bathroom fixtures and shimmering like moonlight on water. I'd stopped coloring it 3 years ago, tired of the expense and the constant maintenance, and had been surprised to discover that the natural color was actually more striking than the artificial brown I'd been maintaining since my 30s. My green eyes were still bright and clear, though lines had appeared at the corners. Laugh lines from the years when Ethan and I had been a team, worry lines from the years since Richard had poisoned him against me. My skin was still smooth, thanks to good genes and the kind of bone structure that aged gracefully, though I could see the subtle signs of all those years of working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, and choosing between eating dinner or paying the electric bill. I looked like what I was, a woman who had worked herself to the bone to give her child every possible advantage. A woman who had worn the same winter coat for 8 consecutive years so Ethan could have the North Face jacket that would help him fit in with his wealthier classmates. A woman who had taken a second mortgage on her grandmother's house to pay for SAT prep courses and college application fees, then sold that house entirely to help with Harvard tuition costs. A woman who had sacrificed her youth, her dreams, her chances at love and companionship and financial security, all so that one day her son could stand in a room full of Boston's elite and feel like he belonged there. And apparently, the sight of me disgusted him. I walked back to the kitchen and read the invitation details more carefully, my mind already shifting into the analytical mode that had served me well during all those years of juggling multiple jobs and impossible schedules. The celebration would be held at the Meridian Club, one of Boston's most exclusive venues, the kind of place where memberships were inherited rather than purchased, where a single dinner cost more than I'd spent on food in some entire months during Ethan's childhood. Months during Ethan's childhood. Black tie required. Cocktails at 7, dinner at 8, speeches to follow. The return address on the digital invitation showed it had been sent from the law offices of Morrison, Kessler and Associates, where Richard Morrison was a senior partner. Richard, who had walked out on us when Ethan was 6 years old, claiming that fatherhood was incompatible with his career trajectory and that he needed space to focus on building something meaningful. Richard, who had reappeared in our lives like a bad penny when Ethan turned 18, suddenly eager to reclaim his role as father to the son who was finally old enough to be useful to his image and social standing. Richard, who had spent the last 5 years systematically poisoning my relationship with Ethan by filling his head with stories about how I was holding him back, how my working-class background was an embarrassment to be overcome, how he deserved better than a mother who cleaned office buildings and altered wedding dresses to pay for his education. I noticed that my name wasn't listed among the hosts of this celebration. This wasn't my party honoring my son's achievement. This was Richard's party, showcasing his success as a father while I was being grudgingly allowed to attend as long as I promised to stay invisible, quiet, and appropriately ashamed of my existence. I sat back down at my kitchen table and stared at the invitation for a long time, feeling something cold and hard settling in my chest. Not the hot flash of anger I might have felt in my younger years, but something much more dangerous, the kind of calm, calculated fury that comes from being pushed too far by someone who has underestimated your capacity for patience and planning. I had been quiet for 5 years. I had accepted Ethan's growing distance, his embarrassment about my background, his obvious preference for Richard's world of wealth and privilege over the modest life we'd built together. I had swallowed his increasingly cruel comments, his casual dismissal of my sacrifices, his apparent amnesia about the 23 years I'd spent raising him as a single mother with no help from anyone. I had told myself that loving him meant giving him space to find his own path, even if that path led him away from me. I had convinced myself that as long as he was happy and successful, my own pain didn't matter. But this invitation, this calculated humiliation disguised as inclusion, was different. This wasn't just my son pulling away to establish his independence. This was my son actively trying to erase me from his life, to reduce me to a shameful secret to be hidden in the back corner of his greatest triumph. And I realized, sitting there in my quiet kitchen with rain pattering against the windows, that I was done being quiet. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out a small metal lockbox I kept hidden behind my winter clothes in the back of my closet. Inside were documents I'd been collecting for the past 3 years, ever since I'd started to suspect that Richard's sudden interest in fatherhood wasn't entirely motivated by paternal love. birth certificates, hospital records, DNA test results, financial documents, email printouts, a USB drive containing hours of recorded conversations, bank statements and property deeds and marriage licenses that told a very different story than the one Richard had been selling to my son. Evidence of lies that had shaped the last 5 years of our lives. Evidence of truths that needed to be told. I had been preparing for this moment without even knowing it, gathering proof like a prosecutor building a case, documenting every inconsistency and deception and manipulation. Not out of malice, but out of love for the son who had forgotten who he really was and where he'd truly come from. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Jensen Productions, a small video company I'd hired the previous year to create a memorial slideshow for my mother's funeral. Marcus Jensen had done beautiful work, and more importantly, he'd been discreet and professional when I'd explained that some family situations required careful handling. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Catherine,
How are you?
is everything all right?" "I'm fine, Marcus. I have a project for you. Something special." "What do you need?" "I need you to create a video. A tribute to my son for his graduation from Harvard Business School. I'll provide all the materials, photos, documents, recordings, everything you'll need. But I need it done professionally, and I need it done by Saturday." "That's pretty tight timing," Marcus said, and I could hear him flipping through what was probably his calendar. "But for you, we can make it work." "What's the budget?" I thought about the money I'd been saving for years, the nest egg I'd been building with the vague hope that maybe, someday, Ethan would remember that he loved me and we could have a relationship again. Money I'd been setting aside for a small house, maybe, or a trip to Europe, or just the security of knowing I could retire someday with dignity. "Whatever it takes," I said, and I meant every word. "This is the most important project of my life. I'll clear my schedule. When can you bring me the materials?" "Tomorrow morning." "And Marcus? This needs to be comprehensive. I want to tell the whole story, not just the pretty parts." There was a pause, and when Marcus spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "Catherine, you know I don't ask questions about content unless I have to. But are you sure about this? Once something like this is out there, there's no taking it back." "I'm sure," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my own voice. It's time for the truth to come out. After I hung up, I made one more call to Sarah Chin, the event coordinator at the Meridian Club. Sarah and I had met 2 years earlier when I was working as a part-time cleaner at one of the office buildings she managed. She was kind, efficient, and most importantly, she understood that sometimes people in service positions needed to look out for each other. "Sarah, it's Catherine Woods. I need to ask you for something unusual." "Of course, Catherine. What can I do for you?" "I understand you're coordinating an event this Saturday evening. A graduation celebration for Ethan Woods." "Yes, it's going to be a beautiful event. Very elegant. Are you involved somehow?" "I'm his mother. And I have a surprise tribute video I'd like to include in the program. Nothing elaborate, just a mother's love letter to her son on his big day." There was a pause, and I could hear Sarah flipping through papers on her desk. "Catherine, the program is already set. The hosts would need to approve any additions, and Mr. Morrison was very specific about the timeline." "I understand," I said quickly. "But Sarah, you know how these things work. Sometimes the most meaningful moments are the unplanned ones. If you could just find a spot for it. Before the speeches, maybe. 10 minutes. That's all I need." Another pause, longer this time. The video would need to be family appropriate, nothing controversial or inappropriate for the venue. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. Of course. Just a mother celebrating her son's achievements. What could be controversial about that? "Send me the video by Friday afternoon. I'll see what I can do."
Thank you, Sarah.
"I mean that. This is important to me." "I know it is, honey. And for what it's worth, any mother who raised a son good enough to graduate from Harvard Business School deserves to be celebrated right alongside him. If only she knew, I thought as I hung up the phone. That evening, I spread all my materials across my dining room table like a general planning a military campaign. 23 years of photographs, documents, and memories. Pictures of Ethan as a baby, as a toddler, as a school-age child beaming with pride at science fairs and spelling bees. Report cards and award certificates and handwritten thank you notes in a child's careful script. But also the other documents. The ones that told a different story about family and loyalty and truth. The ones that would expose Richard Morrison for exactly what he was. I worked until 4 a.m, organizing everything chronologically, crafting a narrative that would take the audience on a journey through my son's life. Not the sanitized version Richard preferred, where his early abandonment was glossed over and my role was minimized to that of a supporting character in his son's success story. The real story. The complete story. The story that would remind Ethan and everyone else in that room exactly who had sacrificed everything to make his success possible, and who had been lying to him for the past 5 years about everything that mattered. By the time I finally went to bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. Not the nervous hope of wanting the best possible outcome, but the cold satisfaction of knowing that justice was finally coming. Saturday couldn't arrive soon enough. The Meridian Club was everything I'd expected and more, a temple to old money and older privilege, where the marble floors echoed with the footsteps of generations of Boston's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across walls lined with oil paintings of long-dead industrialists and politicians, men who had built their fortunes on the backs of people like me and never lost a moment's sleep over it. This was Richard's natural habitat, the environment where he felt most comfortable and powerful, surrounded by wealth and influence, and the unspoken understanding that success was a birthright rather than something earned through struggle and sacrifice. I arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, having spent the afternoon at a salon getting my hair and makeup done by professionals for the first time in over a decade. The stylist, a chatty woman named Carmen, had worked magic with my silver hair, styling it in an elegant updo that emphasized my cheekbones and made my green eyes look larger and more luminous. The makeup artist had enhanced my natural beauty without making me look like I was trying too hard, creating a sophisticated look that whispered confidence rather than shouting desperation. I wore the one truly beautiful dress I owned, a navy blue silk sheath that I'd purchased for my mother's funeral 3 years earlier and hadn't had occasion to wear since. It fit perfectly, skimming my still slender figure and falling to just below my knees in a way that was both elegant and age-appropriate. My shoes were simple black heels that I'd splurged on during Ethan's senior year of high school, and I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings and matching necklace, the only valuable jewelry I'd inherited and never sold, even during the worst financial times. I looked appropriate for the venue, though certainly not as expensively dressed as the other guests. But I looked like what I was, a woman of substance and dignity who had earned her place in that room through 23 years of love and sacrifice. The hostess who greeted me at the entrance was exactly what I'd expected, a young woman in her mid-20s with a kind of polished beauty that spoke of expensive schools, summer houses in the Hamptons, and a trust fund that ensured she'd never have to worry about paying rent or choosing between groceries and gas money. She wore her privilege like perfume, subtle but unmistakable, permeating everything around her. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying the flat, nasal accent of the Boston Brahmin class as she consulted her iPad. "Name? Catherine Woods. I'm Ethan's mother." I watched her expression shift almost imperceptibly, saw the moment of recognition flicker across her perfectly made-up features. She'd clearly been briefed about me, probably by Richard himself, the embarrassing relative who had to be accommodated but contained, managed but not welcomed. Of course. Ms. Woods. Welcome to the Meridian Club. Her tone was professional but distinctly cool, like she was speaking to a vendor rather than a guest. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your table. She led me through the main reception area, past clusters of well-dressed guests holding crystal champagne flutes and engaging in the kind of animated conversation that comes naturally to people who've never had to worry about money or social position. The men wore custom-tailored tuxedos that probably cost more than I'd made in entire months during Ethan's childhood, while the women glittered in designer gowns and jewelry that could have funded a college education. I recognized some faces from the society pages of the Boston Globe and Herald. Prominent lawyers, business executives, politicians' wives, and various members of the cultural elite who formed the backbone of the city's social hierarchy. Richard's people. The world he'd been so desperate to join when he'd abandoned us, and the world he'd finally achieved after building his legal career on the foundation of other people's money and misery. We walked past several round tables set with fine china and elaborate floral arrangements, past the head table where I could see placed cards bearing familiar names written in elegant calligraphy. Richard Morrison, his wife Amanda Hartwell Morrison, several of his law firm partners, various Harvard Business School administrators, and there, in the center of it all, positioned like a prince holding court, Ethan Woods. My son. My beautiful, brilliant boy, looking every inch the successful young businessman in his perfectly tailored tuxedo and confident smile. Your table, the hostess announced as we reached the far corner of the room, behind a decorative pillar and close enough to the service entrance that I could hear the clatter of dishes and the urgent whispers of catering staff preparing for the evening's dinner service. The table was set for 6, but only 3 place settings had been arranged. 2 other name cards sat face down next to mine, suggesting that whoever else was assigned to sit in this social Siberia was equally unwelcome at the main celebration. I hope you enjoy the evening, the hostess said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes before clicking away on her expensive heels. From my corner position, I had a perfect view of the head table and most of the main reception area, while remaining relatively inconspicuous myself. It was, I realized, exactly what Richard would have requested. Close enough that they could claim I'd been included, far enough away that I wouldn't contaminate the elegant atmosphere with my working-class presence. As I settled into my chair and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, I began to study the scene before me with the careful attention of an anthropologist observing a foreign culture. The head table was clearly the center of power and influence in the room. Richard held court at one end, resplendent in what was obviously a custom-made tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly styled and his confident smile suggesting a man completely comfortable with his position at the top of the social hierarchy. At 63, he was still handsome in the way that powerful men often are, not because of his physical features, which were actually rather ordinary, but because of the aura of success and authority that surrounded him like expensive cologne. Beside him sat Amanda, his second wife, looking every inch the Boston society matron in a black designer gown that probably cost more than my annual rent. She was 10 years younger than Richard and came from old Boston money. Her family had made their fortune in shipping during the 19th century and had been using that wealth to buy social position and political influence ever since. Marrying Richard had been a strategic alliance for both of them, combining his legal expertise and ambition with her family connections and inherited wealth. But it was Ethan who commanded the most attention, and rightfully so. At 29, my son had grown into the kind of man who naturally drew all eyes when he entered a room. He was tall and lean like his father, his real father, David Chun, though none of the people at that table knew the truth about his parentage. His dark hair was perfectly styled in the kind of expensive cut that looked effortless, but probably required monthly maintenance, and his intelligent brown eyes missed nothing as he moved through conversations with practiced ease. He wore his success like a perfectly tailored suit, natural and comfortable and utterly convinced of his own worth. The boy who used to help me count quarters at the kitchen table had become a young man who looked like he'd been born to wealth and privilege, like he'd never known what it felt like to go to bed hungry or wake up in a cold apartment because we couldn't afford to pay the heating bill. Richard had done an excellent job molding him into a perfect replica of himself. I watched as various guests approached the head table to offer congratulations and pay their respects to the guest of honor. Harvard classmates who looked like they'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren catalog. Business executives eager to make connections with the bright young graduate. Society matrons who wanted to be seen associating with the Morrison family's latest success story. Ethan moved through these interactions with impressive skill, offering just the right combination of humility and confidence, gratitude and ambition. He was charming without being obsequious, intelligent without being condescending, successful without being arrogant. He'd learned to play the social game with the same precision he'd once applied to his studies. "Excuse me, are you Catherine Woods?" I turned to find a woman approaching my table, middle-aged, professionally dressed, with kind eyes and the sort of warm smile that seemed genuine rather than polite. She looked familiar, though I couldn't immediately place her. Yes,
I am Dr. Jennifer Martinez.
I was Ethan's academic advisor at Harvard Business School. She gestured to one of the empty chairs at my table. "May I sit? I was hoping to have a chance to speak with you." "Of course, please."
Dr.
Martinez settled into the chair beside me, and I noticed that several people at nearby tables were watching our interaction with curiosity. The academic advisor seeking out the mother hidden in the corner. It wasn't the usual social dynamic for events like this. "I want you to know," Dr. Martinez said quietly, leaning closer so our conversation wouldn't be overheard, "what an extraordinary young man you've raised. Ethan was one of the most dedicated students I've ever advised. His work ethic, his determination, his ability to overcome obstacles and maintain perspective despite the pressures of the program, it's truly remarkable." "Thank you," I said, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. "That means a great deal to me. I have to ask, and please forgive me if this is too personal, but did Ethan ever tell you about his scholarship essay? The one he wrote for his financial aid application during his first year?" I shook my head, feeling a familiar pang of exclusion. Ethan hadn't shared details about his academic work with me in years, not since Richard had convinced him that discussing his studies with me was somehow beneath his new station in life. It was about growing up with a single mother who worked multiple jobs to support his education, Dr. Martinez continued, her voice growing more animated as she spoke. About watching you sacrifice your own dreams and comfort so he could pursue his. About learning the value of hard work and determination by watching you get up every morning and face whatever challenges the day might bring. She paused, studying my face carefully as if trying to gauge my reaction. It was one of the most moving pieces of writing I've ever read from a student. The scholarship committee was so impressed that they not only awarded him full funding for the remainder of his program, but they asked if they could use excerpts from his essay in their promotional materials for other students from similar backgrounds. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "He wrote that
3 years ago, yes."
The essay was titled "The Woman Who Raised a Man." It was all about you, Catherine. About your strength and sacrifice and unwavering dedication to his success. I glanced across the room at Ethan, who was now deep in conversation with what appeared to be several Harvard administrators. The disconnect between the son Dr. Martinez was describing and the young man who had told me I disgusted him was jarring and painful. "Dr. Martinez, can I ask you something? When was the last time you spoke with Ethan about his family situation?" "Actually, just a few weeks ago, when he came by my office to return some borrowed books and finalize his transcript requests." She frowned slightly, as if remembering something troubling. "He mentioned that his relationship with his mother had become complicated in recent years. He seemed very conflicted about it, like he was struggling with some kind of guilt or obligation he didn't know how to resolve." guilt or obligation. Not love. Not appreciation. Not even basic affection for the woman who had given him everything. Did he say anything else about our relationship? Dr. Martinez hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with sharing what felt like confidential information. He mentioned that his father had been helping him understand some things about his childhood that he hadn't fully grasped before. About the financial struggles you faced, about the sacrifices you made, about the emotional toll that kind of pressure can take on a family. I felt my jaw clench. Richard had been rewriting our history, painting my sacrifices not as acts of love, but as sources of dysfunction. Taking the beautiful story of our life together and twisting it into something shameful and unhealthy. He seemed to feel that maybe he'd been protecting you unnecessarily, Dr. Martinez continued carefully. That perhaps you were stronger than he'd given you credit for, and that his continued dependence on your emotional support might actually be holding you back from building your own life. The manipulation was breathtaking in its sophistication. Richard hadn't just convinced Ethan that I was an embarrassment. He'd convinced him that maintaining a relationship with me was actually harmful to my own well-being. That the most loving thing he could do was distance himself from me for my own good. Dr. Martinez, I appreciate you sharing this with me, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. And I want you to know that whatever my son has told you about our relationship, I'm proud of the man he's become, even if he's lost his way somewhat in recent years. She reached over and squeezed my hand. For what it's worth, Catherine, I think there's still time for him to find his way back. Sometimes young people get confused about what really matters, especially when they're transitioning into new phases of their lives. But the foundation you gave him, that's still there. The values, the character, the understanding of what it means to work hard and care about others, none of that disappears just because someone temporarily forgets where it came from. As Dr. Martinez returned to her own table, I looked around the room with fresh eyes. These people didn't know me, didn't know my story, didn't understand the journey that had brought Ethan to this moment of triumph. To them, I was just an awkward presence at an elegant party, someone to be politely ignored while they celebrated the success of Richard Morrison's son. But that was about to change. I checked my watch, 7:45. The video should be queued up and ready to play during the dinner program, just before the speeches began. Sarah had confirmed everything via text earlier that day, though her messages had been brief and professional. She'd clearly sensed that there was more to this tribute than a simple maternal celebration, but she'd honored her commitment to include it in the evening's program. At 8 o'clock sharp, the lights dimmed slightly and a chime sounded, indicating that dinner service was about to begin. Guests began making their way to their assigned seats, and I watched as Ethan took his place at the head table, flanked by Richard and Amanda, surrounded by his Harvard friends and Richard's professional associates. He looked completely at home in this world of privilege and prestige, and why shouldn't he? This was the life Richard had been grooming him for since he'd returned to claim his role as father. Corporate success, social status, complete integration into the Boston elite. But as I sat there in my corner table, watching my son prepare to celebrate his achievements while pretending I didn't exist, I felt no sadness, no anger, only a cold, clean sense of anticipation. Tonight, the truth would come to light. All of it. And by the time the evening was over, everyone in this room would understand exactly who Ethan Woods really was and who had made his success possible, whether he liked it or not. Dinner was a masterpiece of culinary artistry that showcased exactly why the Meridian Club commanded such astronomical prices for their events. 5 courses of perfection, each dish presented with the kind of attention to detail that transformed food into art. The first course alone, seared scallops with cauliflower puree and truffle oil, probably cost more than I'd spent on groceries during some entire weeks when Ethan was growing up. From my corner table, I had an unobstructed view of the head table, where my son was clearly in his element. He moved through the evening with the natural confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world, someone who had been born to sit at tables like this and discuss important matters with important people. The transformation was remarkable and heartbreaking in equal measure. The boy who used to help me fold laundry while we watched old movies on our secondhand television. Because we couldn't afford cable and certainly couldn't afford to go to actual movie theaters, had become a young man who looked like he'd emerged fully formed from the pages of Town and Country magazine. Every gesture was perfect. The way he held his wine glass, swirling the expensive Bordeaux with the casual expertise of someone who had been educated about vintages and terroir. The way he cut his beef tenderloin with precise, economical movements that spoke of countless meals at establishments just like this one. The way he leaned back in his chair during conversation, one arm draped casually over the back, while he listened with engaged attention to whatever story Amanda was telling about her latest charitable endeavor. Richard had done an extraordinary job molding him into a perfect replica of himself, polished, sophisticated, completely comfortable navigating the complex social dynamics of Boston's elite circles. During the third course, I watched as Richard stood and placed an affectionate hand on Ethan's shoulder, leaning down to whisper something in his ear that made my son laugh with genuine delight. The gesture was clearly performed for the benefit of the other guests, a demonstration of their close father-son relationship, the successful lawyer passing his wisdom and legacy to the next generation. Several guests at nearby tables smiled approvingly at the display of family harmony. Here was proof that success bred success, that the right kind of parenting and guidance produced the right kind of results. Richard Morrison had raised a son who would carry on the family tradition of achievement and influence. It was a beautiful performance, and one that erased 23 years of my life as completely as if I'd never existed. I found myself remembering the real story of Ethan's childhood, the memories that Richard had worked so hard to help him forget or reframe as sources of shame rather than pride. I remembered the night Ethan was born, in the charity ward of Boston Medical Center, where I'd been working as a janitor to help pay for my prenatal care. Richard had been notably absent from the delivery room, claiming that a big case required his immediate attention. I'd held my son for the first time in a stark, sterile room with no flowers, no celebration, no partner to share the overwhelming joy and terror of new parenthood. I remembered the apartment we'd lived in when Ethan was a toddler, a cramped two-bedroom in a rough neighborhood where gunshots weren't uncommon and the heat got turned off regularly because I couldn't always make the utility payments on time. But Ethan had never complained about the cold. Instead, he'd crawl into my bed and we'd huddle together under every blanket and comforter we owned, and I'd tell him stories about brave knights and noble quests until he fell asleep against my shoulder. I remember the eviction notice we'd received when Ethan was 4 and how I'd carried him and our few belongings to my friend Maria's apartment, where we'd slept on a pull-out couch for 3 months while I worked double shifts at the medical supply company to save enough for a security deposit on a new place. Ethan had thought it was the greatest adventure in the world, like an extended sleepover with his honorary Aunt Maria, who spoiled him with attention and homemade cookies while I was at work. I remembered the Christmas when Ethan was 8 and I'd worked 36 straight hours, a double shift at the medical supply warehouse followed by an all-night cleaning job at a downtown office building, to earn enough money for the chemistry set he'd been wanting for months. I'd wrapped it in newspaper because I couldn't afford gift wrap, and when he'd opened it on Christmas morning, his face had lit up like I'd given him the entire universe. He'd spent the whole day conducting experiments while I dozed on our second-hand couch, exhausted but happy because I'd made his dream come true. I remembered teaching him to read during my commute to work, how we'd practice sight words on the subway and work through basic math problems while I cleaned office buildings in the evenings. Even as a child, he'd understood instinctively that education was our pathway to something better, that every book he read and every test he aced brought us both closer to the life we dreamed of building together. I remembered his first day at Brookline Academy, the prestigious prep school that had become his stepping stone to Harvard. He'd been terrified and excited in equal measure, dressed in a uniform I'd bought secondhand and tailored myself to fit him perfectly. The other students arrived in chauffeured cars or luxury SUVs driven by parents who looked like they'd stepped out of magazine advertisements. We took 3 buses to get there, but Ethan held my hand the entire way and told me he was proud to be my son. When had that changed? When had the boy who'd been proud to be my son become the young man who was disgusted by my very existence? I knew the answer, of course. The transformation had begun on Ethan's 18th birthday, when Richard Morrison had appeared on our doorstep like a conquering hero, ready to reclaim his role as father to the son who was finally old enough to be useful to his image and career. "Catherine," he'd said that day, looking past me to where Ethan stood in our modest living room, "I think it's time Ethan and I got to know each other properly. He's a young man now, with a bright future ahead of him. He deserves every advantage I can provide." I'd watched over the following months as Richard systematically seduced my son with promises of Ivy League connections, prestigious internships, and a future that seemed impossibly bright compared to the working-class life we'd built together. Expensive dinners at restaurants I couldn't pronounce. Weekend trips to Richard's vacation home in the Hamptons. Introduction to a world of wealth and privilege that made our little apartment seem shabby and small by comparison. But the seduction hadn't stopped with material temptations. Richard was far too sophisticated for such obvious manipulation. Instead, he'd begun a careful campaign of psychological warfare, gradually poisoning Ethan's perception of our life together. "Your mother means well," I'd overheard him telling Ethan during one of their dinner meetings at an exclusive downtown restaurant. "But you have to understand that she doesn't really comprehend the requirements of the world you're entering. Her background, her experiences. They're going to hold you back if you're not careful about managing that relationship." Catherine has always been very emotional about these things. He'd explained another time when Ethan had asked why his father hadn't been present during his childhood. "She made it very difficult for me to maintain a relationship with you when you were younger. I tried, believe me, but she was unstable. I thought it was better to wait until you were mature enough to understand the complexities of adult relationships." Lies, all of it. But Richard told them with such authority, such apparent reluctance to criticize me, that they sounded like painful truths rather than calculated deceptions. He presented himself as the patient, long-suffering father who had been denied access to his son by an unreasonable, emotionally volatile woman who couldn't accept that the relationship was over. The transformation in Ethan had been gradual but inexorable. The son who had once spent Sunday mornings making pancakes with me while we planned our week began spending his weekends at Richard's penthouse apartment in Back Bay. The boy who had shared every detail of his school day started keeping his achievements and aspirations to himself, sharing them instead with the father who had purchased his way back into his life with promises and opportunities. By the time Ethan started at Harvard, I'd become an embarrassment to be managed rather than a mother to be loved. Our phone conversations grew shorter and less frequent, punctuated by long silences and awkward pauses. His visits home became obligatory rather than joyful, duty calls that he endured rather than enjoyed. The warm, loving relationship we'd built over 18 years slowly withered under the weight of Richard's manipulation and Ethan's growing ambition. He began to see our modest apartment and simple lifestyle not as proof of my love and sacrifice, but as evidence of my limitations and failure to provide him with the advantages he deserved. "I just think," he'd said during one particularly painful conversation during his sophomore year, "that maybe it's time for both of us to focus on building our own lives instead of being so dependent on each other." Dependent. As if the love between a mother and son was a weakness to be overcome rather than a strength to be cherished. "You're a grown man now," Richard had reinforced during their conversations, which I sometimes overheard when Ethan took his father's calls while visiting me. "Successful men learn to compartmentalize their family relationships. That doesn't mean you love your mother any less. It just means you're mature enough to establish appropriate boundaries. Appropriate boundaries. Like treating me as a distant acquaintance rather than the woman who had given him everything. Now, watching him from across this elegant ballroom, I could see the final product of Richard's careful cultivation. Ethan had become exactly what Richard wanted him to be, a polished, sophisticated young man who looked like he'd been born to privilege, who moved through elite social circles with natural ease, who felt no connection to the working-class struggles that had defined his childhood. He'd learned to see those struggles not as evidence of my strength and determination, but as sources of shame to be overcome and forgotten. During the fourth course, duck breast with cherry reduction and roasted vegetables that were probably more beautiful than most people's wedding flowers, I watched as Ethan engaged in animated conversation with a young woman who was clearly from his Harvard class. She was beautiful in the way that money could buy. Perfect teeth, flawless skin, the kind of expensive haircut that looked effortless but required a team of professionals to maintain. They were discussing their post-graduation plans, their voices carrying just enough for me to catch fragments of their conversation. She was taking a position with Goldman Sachs. He was considering offers from several prestigious consulting firms, all arranged through Richard's extensive network of contacts and connections. The important thing, I heard him say, is to position yourself strategically from the beginning. Make the right connections, align yourself with the right people, build the kind of reputation that opens doors rather than closing them. He sounded exactly like Richard, calculating, ambitious, focused entirely on advancement and social positioning. There was no mention of making a difference in the world, of using his education to help others, of honoring the sacrifices that had made his opportunities possible. The boy who had once told me he wanted to be a teacher because helping people learn things is the most important job in the world had become a young man whose primary concern was leveraging his Harvard degree into maximum social and financial advantage. I felt a sharp pang of grief for the child I'd raised, the sweet, idealistic boy who had believed that success meant making the world a better place rather than just making himself richer and more powerful. But that grief was tempered by something harder and colder. Because I knew something that Richard didn't know I knew, something that would shatter his carefully constructed narrative and force everyone in this room to confront the truth about who Ethan Woods really was and where he'd really come from. As the dinner service concluded and the evening's program prepared to begin, I checked my watch one more time. 9:15, the speeches would start soon, and somewhere in that program was the video that would change everything. Richard was already standing, preparing to give what was undoubtedly a carefully crafted speech about fatherhood and achievement, and the joy of watching his son reach such heights of success. I settled back in my chair and smiled, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in 5 years. Richard Morrison was about to learn that some debts take more than a decade to come due, but they always come due eventually. As Richard began to speak, commanding the room with the natural authority of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, I let my mind drift back to the memories he'd worked so hard to help Ethan forget, or reframe as sources of shame rather than pride. I remembered the night shifts at Boston Medical Center, where I'd worked as a janitor to help pay for Ethan's daycare and my own community college classes. I'd been trying to get my GED while raising a toddler as a single mother, studying medical terminology and basic anatomy in supply closets during my breaks, dreaming of someday becoming a registered nurse, so I could provide a better life for my son. Ethan would often fall asleep in the hospital's family waiting area while I finished my cleaning rounds, curled up on the vinyl chairs with a blanket I'd brought from home. The night nurses took pity on us and would keep an eye on him while I worked, sometimes bringing him juice boxes or crackers from the vending machines when he woke up scared and looking for me. I remembered the apartment we'd lived in during his elementary school years, a cramped 2-bedroom in Alston where the radiators clanged all night and the neighbor upstairs practiced drums at all hours. But it was our home, and I'd made it as warm and welcoming as I could with secondhand furniture I'd refinished myself and artwork Ethan had created at school that I'd framed and hung like it belonged in a museum. Every evening after my day shift at the medical supply warehouse, I'd come home to find Ethan at our kitchen table, working on his homework with the dedication of a child who understood instinctively that education was our pathway to something better. I'd help him with math problems while I prepared our simple dinner, usually pasta or rice with whatever vegetables were on sale that week. And we'd discuss his school day and his dreams for the future. When I grow up, he told me when he was 7, I want to be a scientist so I can discover cures for diseases and help sick people get better. When I grow up, he'd said at 8, I want to be a teacher so I can help kids learn important things. When I grow up, he'd announced at 9, I want to be rich so you don't have to work so hard, Mommy. That last one had broken my heart because it meant he'd notice my exhaustion, my constant stress about money, the way I'd collapse onto our couch after working a double shift, and sometimes fall asleep in my work clothes because I was too tired to change into pajamas. But it had also filled me with determination. If my son was worried about my struggles, then I needed to work harder to hide them from him, while also working toward the day when we'd both be free from financial stress. I remembered the second job I'd taken when Ethan was 10, cleaning office buildings downtown from midnight to 6 a.m. after finishing my day shift at the warehouse. I'd arranged for Mrs. Kowalski, our elderly neighbor, to stay with Ethan while I worked nights, paying her what little I could afford and supplementing with homemade meals and help with her grocery shopping. Ethan never complained about my absence, never made me feel guilty for leaving him. Instead, he'd wait up for me to come home in the mornings, already dressed for school and with his lunch packed, ready to tell me about his evening with Mrs. Kowalski and share whatever new facts he'd learned from his library books. Did you know, he'd say as I helped him with his backpack and walked him to the bus stop, that octopuses have 3 hearts? Mrs. Kowalski didn't know that. I'm going to tell my science teacher today. The third job had come when Ethan was accepted to Brookline Academy on a partial scholarship that covered tuition but not books, uniforms, or the 1,000 small expenses that came with attending an elite preparatory school. I'd started doing alterations and tailoring from our kitchen table, working on wedding dresses and formal wear late into the night after finishing my other jobs. My fingers would be bleeding by morning from the needle pricks and the repetitive motions, but the extra money allowed Ethan to have the same opportunities as his wealthier classmates. I'd bought his textbooks secondhand and his uniforms from a consignment shop that specialized in private school clothing, then tailored everything to fit him perfectly so no one would know we couldn't afford the retail prices. I remembered the science fair when Ethan was 12, where he'd presented a project on renewable energy that had taken us months to research and build. We'd spent weekends at the public library, checking out books on solar panels and wind turbines, and evenings in our kitchen constructing a working model from materials I'd scavenged from my various workplaces. When he'd won first place, beating out projects that had clearly been professionally constructed by hired tutors or scientifically trained parents, his face had glowed with pride and accomplishment. "We did it, Mom," he'd whispered as he hugged me after the awards ceremony. "We really did it."
We.
As if my contribution had been equal to his own, as if we were partners in his success rather than a mother simply supporting her child's efforts. I remembered the day he'd been accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship, how we'd both cried tears of joy and disbelief as we read the acceptance letter together at our kitchen table. It had seemed impossible. A boy from our neighborhood, raised by a single mother who'd never been to college herself, admitted to one of the most prestigious universities in the world. "I couldn't have done this without you," he'd said that day, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I've achieved, everything I've learned about working hard and never giving up, it all came from watching you." When had that gratitude transformed into embarrassment? When had my strength become his shame? I knew the answer, of course. The transformation had begun the moment Richard Morrison had decided to reclaim his role as Ethan's father, rewriting our family history to position himself as the architect of my son's success. Richard's speech was winding down now, and I could see him preparing for his grand finale, the moment when he would call Ethan to the podium to accept the accolades for his Harvard achievement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, his voice carrying easily through the silent ballroom, "I present to you my son, Ethan Woods, Harvard MBA, class of 2024. The applause was thunderous as Ethan rose from his chair, looking every inch the successful young businessman in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. He moved toward the podium with confident steps, accepting congratulations and handshakes from various guests as he passed their tables. When he reached the microphone, he paused for a moment, looking out over the audience with a slight smile that spoke of comfortable self-assurance. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice clear and strong. "This celebration means more to me than I can adequately express, because it represents not just my own achievements, but the support and guidance I've received from people who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself." He spoke about his Harvard experience, about the challenges of business school, about his excitement for the future, and his gratitude for the opportunities he'd been given. His speech was polished and articulate, hitting all the right notes of humility and ambition. But as he continued, I felt my heart breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. Because not once did he mention me. Not once did he acknowledge the woman who had raised him, who had worked herself to exhaustion to fund his education, who had been the constant presence in his life for 23 years before Richard had returned to claim credit for achievements built on my sacrifices. "I'm particularly grateful to my father, Richard Morrison," Ethan continued, gesturing toward the head table where Richard beamed with pride. "His wisdom and guidance have been invaluable as I've navigated the challenges of graduate school and prepared for my career in the business world." The room erupted in applause, and I watched Richard's face glow with satisfaction as Ethan continued to praise his mentorship and influence. "My father has taught me that success isn't just about individual achievement. It's about building something meaningful, creating value for others, and surrounding yourself with people who share your values and commitment to excellence." More applause. More beaming smiles from Richard and Amanda and their circle of friends and colleagues. And still, not a word about me. As Ethan's speech continued, I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. This wasn't just indifference or embarrassment. This was systematic erasure. My son was actively rewriting his own history, crediting Richard with achievements that had been built on my love, my sacrifice, my unwavering determination to give him every possible advantage despite our financial limitations. But as I sat there listening to him erase 23 years of my life from his success story, I felt no sadness.
No anger.
Only anticipation. Because in just a few minutes, the video would play. And then everyone in this room would learn the truth about Ethan Woods. All of it. Whether he was ready for that truth or not. As Ethan concluded his speech to thunderous applause, I watched him return to his seat at the head table, accepting congratulations and handshakes from the guests he passed. Richard stood to embrace him, a gesture that was both paternal and performative, designed to reinforce their relationship for the benefit of everyone watching. The master of ceremonies, a distinguished-looking man who was probably one of Richard's law partners, approached the podium and adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude this evening's celebration, we have a very special surprise. A tribute video that has been prepared by someone very close to Ethan, celebrating his journey and remarkable achievements." I felt my pulse quicken as I watched Ethan's face register confusion, then mild concern, as he glanced toward Richard for explanation. But Richard looked equally puzzled, clearly not having authorized any additional presentations beyond the carefully orchestrated program he'd planned. Amanda leaned over to whisper something in Richard's ear, probably asking if he knew what this unexpected addition might be. I saw him shake his head slightly, his expression shifting from confusion to the kind of wariness that suggested his political instincts were warning him that something was amiss. The lights dimmed throughout the ballroom, and a large projection screen descended from the ceiling with mechanical precision. In the sudden darkness, I felt a smile cross my face for the first time all evening. Not the polite, social smile I'd been wearing for the benefit of the other guests, but something genuine and deeply satisfied. The video opened with a single photograph that filled the entire screen: baby Ethan, perhaps 6 months old, fast asleep in my arms. I looked impossibly young in the picture, barely 29 years old, my face soft with the exhausted contentment of new motherhood. My hair was longer then, falling in waves around my shoulders, and I wore a simple cotton dress that I remembered buying at a thrift store because it was the only thing I could afford that still looked presentable for special occasions. The image held for a moment, allowing the audience to take in the tender intimacy of the scene, before fading to black and being replaced by elegant white text that appeared one line at a time. A Mother's Love, the Ethan Woods story. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the direction of the head table, and I didn't need to look to know it was coming from either Richard or Ethan, both of them beginning to realize that this tribute wasn't going to follow the sanitized narrative they preferred. A gentle piano melody began to play as the next image appeared, Ethan taking his first steps in the cramped living room of our first apartment. The furniture was clearly secondhand and mismatched. The carpet was worn thin in places, and the walls were bare except for a few children's drawings taped up with masking tape. But Ethan's chubby arms were outstretched toward the camera with pure joy, and my voice could be heard encouraging him in the background. The narrator's voice began, my own voice, recorded just 3 days earlier in the quiet of my apartment, speaking words I'd rehearsed and refined until they captured exactly what I wanted to say. Every child is born into a story that's already begun, my voice said over the images, calm and clear and filled with love. This is the story of a little boy who became a Harvard graduate and the woman who made that miracle possible. The photographs continued in careful chronological order, each one selected to tell the story of our life together in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Ethan at 2, helping me sort laundry on our kitchen table while I worked on my alterations business. Ethan at 4, wearing a Halloween costume I'd sewn myself, a superhero cape made from an old bedsheet that I'd decorated with fabric paint during his nap time. Ethan at 6, proudly displaying a science project we'd built together using materials I'd scavenged from my various workplaces and library books we'd checked out to research the topic. His name is Ethan Woods. My recorded voice continued over the images, and he was raised by a single mother who believed that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. I could feel the attention of the entire room focusing on the screen, conversations dying as people realized this wasn't the typical tribute video they'd expected. This was something deeper, more personal, more revealing than the polished presentations usually shown at events like this. The next series of photographs showed our life during Ethan's elementary school years, images I'd taken with a secondhand camera I'd bought at a pawn shop, documenting our daily routines and small celebrations. Ethan reading to me from his favorite books while I folded clothes for my alteration service, both of us sitting on our living room floor surrounded by piles of other people's wedding dresses and formal wear. Ethan helping me prepare dinner in our tiny kitchen, standing on a step stool to reach the counter while I guided his hands as he learned to scramble eggs and make simple sandwiches. Ethan asleep at that same kitchen table, his homework spread around him while I worked late into the night on sewing projects that would pay for his school supplies and field trip fees. Catherine Woods worked 3 jobs to support her son's education. The narration continued, my voice steady despite the emotion underlying the words. She cleaned office buildings at night, worked in a medical supply warehouse during the day, and ran a small alteration business from her home on weekends. She sacrificed her own comfort, her own dreams, her own chances at happiness, because she believed in her son's potential. The photos were having their intended effect. I could hear murmurs throughout the room, the rustle of people shifting in their seats as they began to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a proud mother's tribute. It was the documentation of a sacrifice so complete, so selfless, that it was almost incomprehensible to people who had never experienced real poverty or genuine hardship. Several guests at nearby tables had turned to look at me, their expressions ranging from surprise to admiration to something that might have been pity. They were beginning to understand that the woman sitting quietly in the corner wasn't just Ethan's mother. She was the architect of his success, the foundation upon which everything else had been built. But I was just getting started. The next section of the video focused on Ethan's academic achievements, but contextualized them in ways that revealed the true cost of his success. A photograph of his acceptance letter to Brookline Academy, the prestigious prep school that had been his stepping stone to Harvard, accompanied by an image of the eviction notice we'd received the same week when I'd fallen behind on rent while saving money for his tuition deposit. To pay for Ethan's tuition at Brookline Academy, my voice explained over the contrasting images. Catherine took a fourth job cleaning houses on Sunday mornings. She lost her apartment twice and moved them into progressively smaller places. She wore the same winter coat for 6 years and drove a car that broke down monthly, but Ethan never missed a day of school and never went without the supplies he needed to succeed. The photographs continued, report cards and honor roll certificates interspersed with images that told the real story of our life during those years. My hands, red and cracked from industrial cleaning chemicals, holding Ethan's latest academic award. The stack of bills on our kitchen counter, marked past due in red stamps, next to Ethan's science fair trophy. The tiny studio apartment we'd moved to during his junior year of high school, where he'd slept on a pull-out couch, and I'd slept on an air mattress on the floor so he could have privacy for studying and the dignity of his own space when friends came over. She taught him that dignity came from hard work, not from wealth. The narration continued, my voice growing stronger with conviction. That character was built through struggle, not inherited through privilege. That education was the pathway to freedom, but that freedom had to be earned through sacrifice and determination. I finally allowed myself to look toward the head table, and the sight that greeted me was everything I'd hoped for and more. Ethan's face was pale in the glow from the projection screen, his mouth slightly open as if he were struggling to breathe. His eyes were wide with what might have been shock or recognition, or the dawning realization of truths he'd allowed himself to forget. Richard was leaning forward in his chair, clearly trying to figure out how to stop the video without creating an even bigger scene. His face had gone through several color changes, from confusion to anger to something approaching panic, as he began to understand that his carefully constructed narrative was being systematically dismantled in front of his most important social and professional contacts. Amanda sat rigidly beside him, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the horror in her eyes as she realized that her husband's redemption story was about to be exposed as an elaborate fraud. But the real revelation was still coming. The music stopped abruptly, and the screen went black for several seconds, long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable, for people to wonder if something had gone wrong with the presentation. When the next image appeared, it was a document, official, legal, impossible to dispute or explain away. A collective gasp went through the room like a physical wave as people recognized what they were seeing. But this story has been deliberately hidden, my voice said, its tone changing from nostalgic to serious, from loving to inexorable, because powerful people found it inconvenient, because it interfered with a different narrative they wanted to tell. The document on the screen was Richard's divorce filing from 1995, the year after Ethan was born. In clear, unambiguous legal language, It stated that Richard Morrison was voluntarily relinquishing all parental rights and responsibilities for any children born to Catherine Woods and requesting no future contact with either mother or child. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear someone's sharp intake of breath, the clink of a wine glass being set down too hard, the rustle of fabric as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard Morrison didn't just abandon his son. My voice continued relentlessly, each word falling into the silence like a stone into still water. He legally severed their relationship. He signed papers stating that he wanted no contact, no responsibility, no involvement in Ethan's life whatsoever. He paid no child support. He sent no birthday cards. He didn't know what grade Ethan was in, what school he attended, or even what he looked like. The next document was even more damning. Richard's marriage certificate to Amanda Hartwell, dated just 6 months after his divorce from me was finalized. The timeline made it crystal clear that Richard had left his pregnant girlfriend to marry a woman from a wealthy Boston family, choosing social advancement over parental responsibility without a moment's hesitation. For 18 years, the narration continued as the documents remained on screen for everyone to read and absorb. Richard Morrison lived his life as if Ethan Woods didn't exist. He built a legal career, married into Boston society, and created a new identity for himself that had no room for the working-class child he'd left behind. I watched Richard's face cycle through emotions: shock, anger, calculation, desperation. He was trying to figure out damage control strategies, but there was no controlling this avalanche of truth. His carefully constructed reputation was crumbling in real time, and everyone who mattered to his career and social standing was witnessing the destruction. But when Ethan turned 18 and was accepted to Harvard University, my voice continued. Richard Morrison suddenly remembered he had a son. The screen filled with a series of photographs that I'd obtained through social media research and private investigators over the past 3 years. Richard and Ethan at expensive restaurants, at country club events, at business networking functions. Pictures that showed the systematic seduction of my son by a father who had decided he was finally worth claiming. Richard Morrison spent 5 years convincing Ethan that his mother was an embarrassment. My voice said over the images of their manufactured relationship that her working-class background was holding him back, that his success belonged to the father who had provided guidance and connections, not the mother who had provided love and sacrifice. The final photograph in this section was particularly devastating. Ethan and Richard at what appeared to be a Harvard alumni event, both wearing tuxedos, both laughing at some shared joke. The caption, taken from Richard's social media account, read, "Proud father and son enjoying Harvard Business School's Donor Appreciation Gala." Donor Appreciation Gala. Richard had literally bought his way into Ethan's educational experience after 18 years of complete absence, and was now taking credit for achievements built entirely on my sacrifice. The murmurs in the room were growing louder now, people beginning to voice their shock and disgust at what they were witnessing. Several guests had turned to stare openly at Richard, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright contempt. But I wasn't finished yet. Not even close. The most devastating revelation was still to come. The music swelled again, but this time it was different. Not nostalgic or melancholy, but triumphant, building towards something momentous. The screen filled with new images I'd been holding in reserve, screenshots of text messages and email printouts that would expose not just Richard's abandonment, but the active role he'd played in destroying my relationship with Ethan. But the most important truth has been hidden until tonight, my voice said, taking on a tone of absolute certainty that cut through the growing murmur of the audience. The truth about who really believed in Ethan Woods, who really supported his dreams, who really made his success possible. The first text message appeared on screen, dated 3 years earlier, and the sight of it made my heart clench with remembered pain. From Ethan to Catherine, "Mom, I got the full scholarship to Harvard Business School. They said my essay about you was the most moving personal statement they'd ever read. I wrote about how you taught me that strength comes from protecting the people you love, not from running away when things get hard. I wrote about your courage and sacrifice and how you never gave up on us, even when everything seemed impossible. I love you so much, and I can't wait to celebrate with you. Below the text was a delivery failure notice. The message had bounced back because the number was no longer in service. A note at the bottom of the screen explained, this message was never received because Richard Morrison had convinced Ethan to block his mother's phone number for his own emotional health. A shocked murmur ran through the room. People were beginning to understand that this wasn't just a story about abandonment and manipulation. It was about the systematic destruction of a loving relationship between mother and son. The next image was an email from Ethan to his Harvard academic advisor, Dr. Martinez, expressing profound guilt about his deteriorating relationship with his mother. I know she sacrificed everything for me, and I feel terrible about how distant I've become. But my father says I need to focus on my future instead of feeling obligated to my past. He says successful people learn to compartmentalize their family relationships, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm betraying the person who made all of this possible. I just wish there was a way to honor what she did without letting it hold me back from the life I want to build. Dr. Martinez's response was included in the screenshot. Ethan, gratitude and love for your mother aren't obstacles to your success. They're the foundation of your character. You might want to reconsider who's giving you advice about compartmentalizing family relationships. But the most damning evidence was still to come. The screen went black again, and when the next image appeared, it was an audio waveform, the visual representation of recorded conversations. The following recordings were obtained legally and with the knowledge of at least one party to each conversation, appeared in text at the bottom of the screen, covering the legal bases while making it clear that what was about to be played was authentic and admissible. Richard's voice filled the ballroom, unmistakable despite the slight distortion of the recording equipment. Ethan, you have to understand that your mother is emotionally manipulative. She uses guilt to control you, to make you feel responsible for her choices and her limitations. Successful men learn to recognize these patterns and protect themselves from them. Ethan's voice, younger and more uncertain. But Dad, she worked so hard for me. She gave up everything. She gave up everything because she chose to, Richard interrupted, his tone patient but firm. Those were her decisions, not yours. You don't owe her anything beyond basic respect and occasional contact. You certainly don't owe her access to your professional life or your future success. The recording continued, Richard's voice becoming more persuasive and manipulative with each exchange. Your mother's background, the poverty, the multiple jobs, the constant struggle, that's not something to be proud of, Ethan. That's evidence of poor planning and limited capability. If she had been stronger, smarter, more capable, she would have found better solutions to her problems. She had 18 years to improve her situation, Richard continued in another clip, but she chose to stay dependent on your success instead of building her own life. That's not love, son. That's emotional vampirism. You can't let her working-class mentality limit your potential. Sometimes loving someone means making difficult choices about how much access they have to your life and your achievements. The recordings played for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, each one more damning than the last. The audience listened in horrified silence as they heard a father systematically destroying his son's relationship with his mother, using sophisticated psychological manipulation to convince a young man that love was weakness and gratitude was a burden to be discarded. When the audio finally stopped, the silence in the room was absolute. I could see people looking around at each other, their faces reflecting shock and disgust, and the kind of uncomfortable recognition that comes from witnessing something truly evil. But there was one more revelation to come, the biggest one of all. The screen went black again, and when the next image appeared, it was a medical document that made several people in the room gasp audibly. A DNA test. Recent. Conclusive. Performed by one of the most reputable genetic testing laboratories in the country. The results were displayed clearly for everyone to read. 99.97% probability that Richard Morrison was not the biological father of Ethan Woods. The silence in the room became something alive and oppressive, pressing down on everyone present as they processed the implications of what they were seeing. But Richard Morrison had one more secret. My voice said, its tone now cold as winter ice. A secret that would have destroyed his carefully constructed relationship with the son he'd abandoned and reclaimed. The results remained on screen while additional information appeared below them. Details about when the test had been conducted, by whom, and under what circumstances. Everything was documented, verified, unquestionable. Richard Morrison spent 5 years claiming credit for achievements that weren't just built on another woman's sacrifice. My voice continued remorselessly. They were built by a child who wasn't even his. The final image was the most devastating of all. A photograph of a man I'd dated briefly before meeting Richard, a man named David Chen who had died in a construction accident when Ethan was 2 years old. The resemblance between David and my son was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. The same warm brown eyes, the same strong jawline, the same gentle expression that spoke of innate kindness and integrity. Ethan's real father was David Chen. My voice said softly, with more love and warmth than I'd used for any other part of the presentation. A carpenter and volunteer firefighter who believed in honest work and treating people with dignity. A man who died trying to save others when a construction crane collapsed, never knowing he had left behind a son who would grow up to embody all of his best qualities. A photograph appeared showing David in his volunteer firefighter gear, then another of him working on a Habitat for Humanity project, then one of him reading to children at a local library during his off hours. David Chun would have been proud of the man Ethan became, the narration continued. And he would have honored the woman who raised his child with love and sacrifice and unwavering determination. The video ended with a final photograph, Ethan and me from his high school graduation 4 years earlier, both of us crying tears of joy and accomplishment as he received his diploma. We looked like what we were, a mother and son who had fought the world together and won. The last words appeared on screen in simple white text. Ethan Woods was raised by a woman who loved him enough to give him everything, and a man who thought he was worth abandoning. Tonight, he gets to choose which legacy he wants to claim. The screen went dark, and for a long moment, the entire ballroom was silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then someone began to applaud. Slowly at first, a single person clapping with deliberate, measured rhythm. Then others joined in, the sound building and spreading until the entire room was on its feet, giving me a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Everyone except 3 people, Richard, Amanda, and Ethan. They sat frozen at the head table, their faces masks of shock and devastation and the kind of horror that comes from watching your entire world collapse in public. Richard's carefully maintained composure had completely shattered. His face had gone gray, and his mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish out of water. The confident lawyer, the Boston socialite, the successful father figure. All of it was gone, leaving only a broken old man who had finally been exposed for what he really was. Amanda sat rigidly beside him, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the horror in her eyes. This was her social circle, her world, and she had just watched her husband's reputation destroyed in front of everyone who mattered to their Boston elite lifestyle. The carefully cultivated image of the successful power couple had been revealed as an elaborate fraud built on lies and manipulation. But it was Ethan's face that held my attention. My son looked like he was watching his entire identity disintegrate in real time. The confidence, the polish, the sense of belonging that Richard had spent 5 years helping him build. All of it was cracking apart as the truth settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He was staring at me across the room with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly, but also something that might have been recognition, or relief, or the dawning understanding of truths he'd been forced to forget. The applause finally died down, and an uncomfortable silence filled the room. People were looking between me, still standing calmly by my corner table, and the devastated trio at the head table. No one seemed to know what to do next, how to process what they'd just witnessed, how to respond to such a complete and public destruction of carefully maintained lies. It was Richard who finally broke the silence, lurching to his feet with the desperate energy of a drowning man. This is fabrication," he said, his voice shaking with rage and desperation.
Lies.
Doctored documents. A sick attempt at revenge by a woman who... Richard. The single word came from Dr. Martinez, who had risen from her table near the front of the room. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations and had no patience for additional drama. "I think it's time for you to stop talking. You don't understand," Richard pressed on, his voice rising with hysteria. "This woman is mentally unstable. She's been stalking us, fabricating evidence, creating an elaborate hoax too." "Mr. Morrison." Another voice, this one from Judge William Crawford, one of Boston's most respected jurists and a man I recognized from newspaper photos covering high-profile cases. "As someone who has worked with you professionally for many years, I strongly advise you to remain silent. Anything you say right now is only going to make your situation significantly worse." Judge Crawford's intervention carried weight that even Richard couldn't ignore. As one of the most prominent members of Boston's legal establishment, his public rebuke was essentially a death sentence for Richard's career and reputation. But Richard was beyond rational thought now, driven by panic and the realization that everything he'd built was crumbling around him. "You can't believe this," he said, appealing directly to the audience. 23 years of bitter resentment, of planning revenge against a man who moved on with his life. This is what vindictive women do when they can't accept.
Enough.
Judge Crawford's voice cut through Richard's desperate rambling like a sword. "Mr. Morrison, you have just been exposed as a fraud and a manipulator in front of half the legal establishment of Boston. If you say another word, one more word, I will personally ensure that the Massachusetts Bar Association begins disciplinary proceedings against you first thing Monday morning." The threat hung in the air like a death sentence. Richard finally seemed to understand that his situation was beyond salvage, that no amount of explanation or justification was going to restore what he'd lost in the past 10 minutes. He slumped back into his chair like a deflated balloon, his face gray with defeat and the dawning realization that his carefully constructed life was over. Amanda leaned over to whisper something urgent in his ear, probably suggesting damage control strategies or escape plans. But Richard just shook his head numbly, clearly understanding that it was too late for anything except accepting the consequences of his choices. Dr. Martinez approached our small group at the head table, her professional demeanor intact despite the chaos swirling around us. "Catherine," she said warmly, extending her hand to me as I walked over to join them. "I think I speak for everyone here when I say that what we've witnessed tonight has been both shocking and profoundly moving. Your strength and dignity in the face of such systematic manipulation is truly remarkable." She turned to Ethan with compassion in her eyes. "And Ethan, I want you to know that discovering difficult truths about your family, however painful, doesn't diminish your achievements or your character. The foundation your mother gave you, that's still there. That's still real and valuable and worthy of respect." Rachel Kim, the journalist who had interviewed me earlier in the evening, appeared at my elbow with her recording device and a look of professional excitement barely contained beneath her respectful demeanor. "Ms. Woods, this is an incredible story. Would you be willing to do a follow-up interview? I think our readers would be very interested in hearing more about your journey, about how you maintained hope during those difficult years when—" "Not tonight," I said firmly but kindly. "Tonight is about family, about truth, about healing from years of deception. Perhaps we can speak later, but right now, my son and I need time to process what's happened here." I turned back to Ethan, who was still staring at me with that lost, confused expression that broke my heart. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about his family, about his identity, all of it had just been revealed as carefully constructed lies. "Ethan," I said gently, my voice carrying clearly enough that nearby guests could hear, but not so loud as to make our conversation a public spectacle. "Would you like to leave? We could go somewhere quiet, just the two of us, and talk through all of this." He nodded mutely, then seemed to remember his manners and his training in social graces. Yes. That would be, yes, please." As we prepared to leave, I couldn't resist one final look at Richard, the man who had stolen 5 years of my relationship with my son, who had systematically poisoned him against me, who had built his renewed fatherhood on lies and manipulation and the calculated destruction of authentic love. He was slumped in his chair, staring at the table, looking every one of his 63 years. The confident lawyer, the Boston socialite, the successful father figure, all of it was gone, leaving only a broken old man who had finally been exposed for what he really was. "Richard," I said, my voice carrying just enough to be heard by the people at nearby tables. He looked up at me with eyes that held no fight left in them, no calculation or manipulation or desperate schemes for recovery. "You were right about one thing," I said quietly, letting each word fall into the silence with deliberate precision. "I have been planning this for a long time. Ever since the day you convinced my son that I was an embarrassment to be hidden rather than a mother to be honored." I paused, letting the words sink in while maintaining eye contact with the man who had tried so hard to destroy everything I'd built with Ethan. "But you were wrong about everything else. Ethan didn't outgrow me.
You stole him from me.
You manipulated him, lied to him, and convinced him to betray the woman who had given him everything." I leaned slightly closer, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but still audible to those listening. "And tonight I took him back." Richard's face crumpled completely, and I felt no satisfaction in his destruction. Only a clean, clear sense of justice finally served, of truth finally told, of love finally vindicated. I offered my arm to Ethan, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it. Together, we walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind the wreckage of Richard's lies and the beginning of whatever came next for us. The last thing I heard as we left was the sound of conversations resuming throughout the room, hundreds of voices discussing what they had just witnessed, dissecting the revelation, spreading the story that would be Boston's biggest scandal for months to come. Richard Morrison's reputation was finished. His marriage was probably over. His relationship with Ethan was certainly destroyed. And for the first time in 5 years, I was walking somewhere with my son by my side. It wasn't the ending I had originally planned when I'd started gathering evidence 3 years ago, but it was the ending we both needed. Justice had been served. Truth had been told. And love, patient, enduring, unconditional love, had finally triumphed over manipulation and lies. We drove in silence through the dark Boston streets, Ethan behind the wheel of his pristine BMW, while I sat in the passenger seat watching the city blur past the windows. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes when two people have so much to say that they don't know where to begin. Ethan had offered to take me back to my apartment, but neither of us seemed ready for the conversation that was waiting for us there. Instead, we found ourselves at the Boston Harbor waterfront, sitting on a bench overlooking the dark water with the city lights reflected like broken stars on the surface. It was past midnight, and the usual crowds of tourists and late-night joggers were long gone, leaving us alone with the gentle sound of waves against the dock and the distant hum of traffic from the city behind us. "I don't know what to say." Ethan finally spoke, his voice barely audible above the water. "I don't even know where to start." I looked at my son in profile, noting how young he looked without his confident mask, how much he resembled the uncertain boy I remembered rather than the polished young man he'd become under Richard's influence. "You don't have to say anything tonight," I replied gently. "This is a lot to process. More than anyone should have to handle in a single evening." "The DNA test," he said, still staring out at the water. "How long have you known?" 3 years. "I had it done when you started pulling away from me, when Richard's influence became so strong that I barely recognized the son I'd raised. I needed to understand what hold he had over you, what made his claims to fatherhood so compelling that you were willing to forget 23 years of love and sacrifice." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him working through the implications, the timeline, the careful planning that had led to tonight's revelation. "And you never told me. Would you have believed me? 3 years ago, when you were completely under his influence, if I had come to you with this information, what would you have done?" He closed his eyes, and I could see him thinking through the scenario. 3 years ago, he would have accused me of fabricating evidence, of being jealous of his relationship with Richard, of trying to manipulate him out of spite and resentment. "I would have thought you were lying," he admitted, his voice thick with shame. "I would have accused you of making it up to try to turn me against him. I knew that. So I waited. I gathered evidence, I documented everything, and I waited for the right moment to tell the truth in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away." "The graduation dinner." "The graduation dinner," I confirmed, "where Richard was going to celebrate your achievements in front of all his friends and colleagues, taking credit for work that was built on my sacrifices and your real father's character." Ethan turned to look at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down. "Tell me about him. About David Chen. About my real father." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes as I thought about David, the man I'd loved briefly but deeply before Richard had swept me away with his ambition and confidence and promises of a future that had turned out to be built on lies. "His name was David Chen," I began, pulling out my phone to show Ethan a photograph I'd carried for 29 years, David in his work clothes, smiling at the camera with the same warm brown eyes that Ethan had inherited. He was a carpenter, 2 years older than me, working construction during the day and taking engineering classes at community college in the evenings. We met at a coffee shop where I was working weekends to supplement my income from the medical supply job. I watched Ethan study the photograph intently, and I could see him recognizing himself in David's features, not just the physical resemblance, but something deeper, something in the expression that spoke of kindness and integrity. He was genuinely kind, I continued. Not charming in the way that Richard was, but kind in a way that was rare among the men I'd known. He treated everyone with respect, the waitresses, the janitors, the security guards at the construction sites. He believed that honest work had dignity regardless of how much it paid or how much social status it carried. What happened to him? This was the question I'd been dreading, the one that cut deepest because it represented not just loss but lost possibilities. Construction accident when you were 2 years old. A crane malfunction at a building site downtown. The load shifted while a crew was working on the upper floors, and David saw what was happening before anyone else did. I paused, remembering the devastating phone call that had changed everything, the news that had forced me to confront the reality of raising a child alone without any support system. He spent the last few minutes of his life moving other workers to safety, getting them out of the danger zone before the crane collapsed. He saved 6 people's lives that day. The investigators said that if he had run to safety himself instead of helping others, he probably would have survived. Did he know about me? This was the question that haunted me, the one that kept me awake some nights even after all these years.
No.
By the time I realized I was pregnant, I'd already met Richard and thought he was your father. David had taken a job in California, and we'd lost touch. I thought about trying to contact him when you were born, but Richard was so excited about being a father, so involved in the pregnancy and the preparations, that it seemed easier to let him believe you were his son. I felt the weight of that decision, the way it had shaped all our lives in ways I could never have predicted. By the time David died and I started to suspect the truth about your parentage, you were calling Richard Daddy, and I saw no reason to complicate things with information about a man you'd never know. Ethan was quiet for several minutes, processing this information, trying to reconcile the father he'd never known with the man who'd claimed that title through abandonment and manipulation. Richard knew, though. He knew he wasn't my biological father. I suspect he's known for years. Probably since you were a teenager, and the physical differences became more obvious. Richard is many things, but he's not stupid. He would have noticed that you didn't look like him, that your personality and values were different from his own. So, when he came back into my life when I turned 18, he was claiming something he had no right to claim, taking credit for raising a son he'd abandoned, for achievements built on another man's character and a woman's sacrifice. He was stealing not just from me, but from David's memory. The silence stretched between us again, but it felt different now. Less uncomfortable, more contemplative. I could sense Ethan working through years of confusion and conflicted feelings, trying to reconcile the narrative Richard had fed him with the evidence of his own experience. The essay, Ethan said suddenly.
Dr.
Martinez mentioned an essay I wrote about you for my Harvard scholarship application. I heard about that tonight for the first time. I wrote about how you taught me that strength meant protecting the people you love, not running away when things got hard. About how you worked yourself to exhaustion to give me opportunities you'd never had. About how your courage and determination shaped everything I believed about honor and responsibility. He laughed bitterly, a sound that held no humor whatsoever. And then I spent the next 3 years acting like I was ashamed of you. Like the values you taught me were weaknesses to be overcome rather than strengths to be celebrated. Richard can be very persuasive, I said carefully. He told you what you wanted to hear, that your success belonged to you alone, that you didn't owe anyone anything, that you could leave your past behind and become whoever you wanted to be. But that's not true, is it? I looked at my son, really looked at him, seeing past the expensive clothes and polished mannerisms to the core of who he was beneath all of Richard's influence. Ethan, you are successful because of the values David would have taught you if he'd lived, and the character I tried to instill in you during the years I raised you alone. Your intelligence, your work ethic, your determination to excel, those came from within you, shaped by love and sacrifice and the understanding that nothing worthwhile comes easy. I paused, choosing my words carefully because I knew how important this moment was for both of us. Richard gave you opportunities, yes. Connections and financial support and access to networks that made your path smoother. But he didn't create your character. He just tried to reshape it in his own image, to convince you that success meant abandoning the people who loved you rather than honoring them. And I let him. You were 18 years old when he came back into your life. You'd never had a father figure, and suddenly this successful, confident man was offering you everything you'd ever dreamed of. Of course you were influenced by him. Of course you wanted to believe that he could give you the kind of life you'd never imagined possible. Ethan stood up and walked to the edge of the dock, staring out at the dark water with his hands in his pockets. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion and shame. I said terrible things to you. Tonight, in that invitation, I told you that you disgusted me, that you had since day one. Yes, you did. And you came anyway. Of course I came. You're my son. I've loved you every day for 29 years. Even when you made it clear that love wasn't welcome. Even when loving you meant watching you reject everything I'd tried to teach you. He turned back to face me, and I could see tears streaming down his face in the light from the harbor lamps. How do you forgive someone for that? How do you forgive someone for believing lies about you? For choosing the person who abandoned them over the person who sacrificed everything for them? I stood up and walked over to him, placing my hands on his shoulders the way I used to when he was a child and needed comforting. Ethan, forgiveness isn't something you earn through suffering or shame. It's something you accept through understanding. You were manipulated by someone who had years of practice at bending people to his will, someone who knew exactly which psychological buttons to push to make you doubt your own experiences and memories. But the things I said, the way I treated you, hurt me deeply, I admitted, because he needed to understand the real consequences of his choices. There were nights I cried myself to sleep wondering what I'd done wrong, wondering how the son I'd raised with so much love could look at me with such contempt and dismissal. I paused, letting him absorb the reality of the pain he'd caused while also offering him the possibility of redemption. But I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Because I knew that somewhere underneath Richard's influence was the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read to him. The boy who would help me fold laundry and tell me about his dreams for the future. The boy who wrote an essay about how his mother's strength had shaped his character. Ethan collapsed against me then, sobbing like the child he'd once been. I held him while he cried, feeling 5 years of distance and hurt and manipulation finally washing away in the salt air of Boston Harbor. "I'm sorry," he whispered against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Mom. For everything. For forgetting who you were, for forgetting who I was, for letting him convince me that loving you was something to be ashamed of." "I know you are," I said, stroking his hair the way I used to when he had nightmares. "And I forgive you. Completely and without reservation." We stood there for a long time, mother and son reunited, while the harbor water lapped gently against the dock and the city lights twinkled around us like a promise of better days ahead. When Ethan finally pulled back, his eyes were red but clearer than they'd been in years, like he was seeing the world, and himself, with fresh perspective. "What happens now?" he asked. I smiled at him, the first completely genuine smile I'd given him in 5 years. "Now we figure out how to be a family again. It won't be easy. We both have a lot of healing to do, a lot of trust to rebuild. But we have time, and we have love, and most importantly, we have the truth." "And Richard?" I looked back toward the city, thinking about the man who had tried so hard to destroy our relationship and had ultimately only made it stronger through his very cruelty. Richard will have to live with the consequences of his choices. His reputation is destroyed, his marriage is probably over, and everyone in his social and professional circle now knows exactly what kind of man he really is. But that's not my concern anymore. Will it be enough? After everything he put you through, everything he stole from us? I considered the question seriously. Was it enough? The public humiliation, the professional consequences, the complete destruction of the life he'd built on lies and manipulation? Yes, I said finally, because the most important thing, the only thing that ever really mattered, was getting my son back. And tonight I did. Ethan smiled then, the warm, genuine smile I remembered from his childhood, the one that had gotten him through all our hardest times together. "Can I take you home, Mom? I'd like that very much." As we walked back to his car, I felt lighter than I had in years. The truth was finally out, the lies had been exposed, and my son was walking beside me again. Not as an obligation or a burden, but as family. Richard Morrison had spent 5 years trying to steal my child from me, convincing him that his authentic self wasn't good enough, and that his relationship with me was something to be overcome rather than celebrated. But in the end, Love had proven stronger than manipulation, truth had triumphed over lies, and family had survived even the most calculated assault. It had taken 29 years, 3 jobs, countless sacrifices, and one perfectly executed revelation, but justice had finally been served. And it was sweeter than I had ever imagined. The fallout from the graduation dinner began within hours and continued for weeks, spreading through Boston's legal and social circles like wildfire through dry timber. I woke up Sunday morning to find 43 missed calls on my phone and a stack of newspapers outside my apartment door that my neighbor had thoughtfully collected when she saw the reporters gathering in the lobby. The Boston Globe's headline read, "Prominent attorney exposed in elaborate paternity fraud." The Herald went with, "Harvard grad discovers truth about lying father." Even the Wall Street Journal had picked up the story, focusing on the implications for Morrison, Kessler and Associates, and their high-profile corporate clients. Below the headlines was a photograph someone had taken outside the Meridian Club the night before. Richard being escorted to his car by what appeared to be private security, his face hidden behind his hands while Amanda walked several steps ahead of him, her body language suggesting she wanted as much distance as possible from the man she'd married. By noon, my building was surrounded by news vans and reporters hoping for an interview with the woman who had orchestrated one of the most devastating public exposures in Boston's recent memory. I ignored them all, closing my curtains and unplugging my landline. This story wasn't about revenge or scandal. It was about truth and justice and the relationship between a mother and son. I had no interest in feeding the media circus that was already spinning beyond anyone's control. Ethan arrived at my apartment around 2 o'clock, looking exhausted but somehow lighter than he had in years. He'd spent the morning fielding calls from classmates, professors, and reporters, all wanting to know his side of the story, his reaction to the revelations, his plans for the future. "How are you holding up?" I asked, settling him on my couch with a cup of coffee and the kind of maternal attention I hadn't been allowed to show him in years. "I keep expecting to wake up and discover this was all some kind of nightmare," he said, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that reminded me powerfully of the little boy he'd once been. But then I remember how I felt watching that video, finally understanding what really happened, and I know it was the best thing that could have happened to me. He paused, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "Richard called me this morning. 14 times. I finally answered on the 15th call." "What did he say?" "He wanted to explain. To give me his version of events. To convince me that you'd manipulated the evidence, taken things out of context, that the DNA test was somehow falsified or misinterpreted." Ethan looked up at me with eyes that were clear and certain in a way they hadn't been for years. "And what did you tell him?" I told him that for the first time in 5 years, everything finally made sense. That I remembered who I was before he came back into my life and convinced me to be ashamed of it. That I was disgusted with the man I'd become under his influence, and that I wanted nothing more to do with him or his lies. How did he respond? He hung up, but not before telling me that I was making the biggest mistake of my life, that I'd regret choosing you over him, that I was throwing away opportunities and connections that could never be replaced. I felt a flash of the old anger at Richard's continued attempts to manipulate and control, but it passed quickly. He was facing the destruction of everything he'd built, his reputation, his marriage, his place in Boston society. Lashing out at Ethan was just the desperate reaction of a man who had lost everything and couldn't accept responsibility for his own choices. "I'm sorry he put you in that position. Don't be." I needed to say those things. I needed him to understand that his hold over me was broken, that I could see clearly for the first time in years. The intercom buzzed, and I was surprised to hear Dr. Martinez's voice asking to come up. I'd given her my address the night before when she'd offered to provide professional counseling support for both Ethan and me as we navigated the aftermath of such a dramatic revelation. She arrived carrying a bottle of wine and a bag of takeout from our favorite Chinese restaurant, her usual professional demeanor replaced by something warmer and more personal. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," she said, "but I thought you might want some company while the media circus is going on downstairs. And I figured you might not have had a chance to eat today with everything that's been happening." We spent the afternoon talking, really talking about everything that had happened, everything that had led to this moment, and everything that would come next. Dr. Martinez helped us process the magnitude of the revelation, the psychological impact of Richard's manipulation, and the steps we need to take to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than the mixture of love and resentment that had characterized our interactions for the past 5 years. "The thing you need to understand, Ethan," she said as we worked through our third container of lo mein, "is that what happened to you is a recognized form of psychological abuse. Parental alienation is a real phenomenon, and Richard executed it with textbook precision." "How so?" "He waited until you were at a vulnerable age, 18, leaving home, forming your adult identity, then positioned himself as the gateway to the life you wanted while systematically undermining your relationship with your mother. He used your natural desire for independence against you, making you feel that loving Catherine was a sign of emotional immaturity rather than evidence of good character." Ethan nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "It all feels so obvious now, but at the time it seemed like he was just helping me understand complex adult relationships. At the time, you were being manipulated by someone who had decades of practice at bending people to his will. Don't blame yourself for falling for techniques that have destroyed families far stronger than yours." As the afternoon wore on, my phone kept ringing with interview requests from national news outlets, but I continued to ignore them. The only call I answered was from my friend Maria, who had seen the news coverage and wanted to make sure I was all right. "Catherine, Mija, I cannot believe what I'm seeing on television," she said, her voice carrying the warmth and concern that had sustained me through so many difficult years. "That man, he tried to steal your boy from you like some kind of emotional kidnapper?" "He tried, yes, but he failed. And now you have your son back." I looked across the room at Ethan, who was deep in conversation with Dr. Martinez about his plans for the future, his career goals, his desire to rebuild our relationship and honor the values I'd tried to teach him. "Yes," I said, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. "Now I have my son back." That evening, after Dr. Martinez had left and the reporters had finally given up their vigil outside my building, Ethan and I sat together on my couch looking through old photo albums. Pictures of his childhood that I'd preserved through all our moves and financial struggles, memories of the life we'd built together before Richard had interfered with his lies and manipulation. "Look at this one," Ethan said, pointing to a photograph of him at age 10, wearing a homemade Halloween costume and grinning at the camera. "I remember you staying up all night sewing that cape because I decided at the last minute that I wanted to be Superman instead of a pirate. You told me that Superman's real power wasn't his strength. I remembered. It was that he never gave up on people, even when they gave up on themselves. I used to believe that. You can believe it again." He closed the album and turned to face me, his expression serious but hopeful. "Mom, I want you to know that what happened tonight, the video, the revelation, all of it, it wasn't just about exposing Richard's lies. It was about showing me who I really am. Who I was before he convinced me to be ashamed of where I came from." "And who are you?" Ethan smiled, and for the first time in years, it was the smile I remembered from his childhood. Warm, genuine, full of love and possibility. "I'm the son of Catherine Woods, a woman who taught me that strength comes from protecting the people you love, not from running away when things get hard. A woman who showed me that character is built through struggle, not inherited through privilege." He paused, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "And I'm the son of David Chen, a man I never got to meet but whose values live in me anyway." A man who believed in honest work and treating people with dignity, who died trying to protect others because that's what good men do. Tears filled my eyes as I listened to my son reclaim his identity, choosing the legacy of love and sacrifice over the empty promises of wealth and status. That's exactly who you are, I whispered. I want to honor that, Ethan continued. I want to build a life that would make both of them proud. David for his integrity and selflessness, you for your strength and determination. What does that look like? I don't know yet. But I know it doesn't look like the life Richard was planning for me. It doesn't look like using my Harvard degree to make rich people richer while pretending that success is just about personal achievement. The next morning brought news that would cement Richard's downfall completely. Amanda Morrison had filed for divorce, and according to the statement released by her attorney, she was seeking dissolution of their marriage based on fraud, deception, and irreconcilable differences regarding moral character and personal integrity. More damaging still, 3 of Richard's former clients had come forward claiming that he had misrepresented facts in their cases, using the same manipulative techniques he employed on Ethan to convince them to accept settlements or plea agreements that weren't in their best interests. The Massachusetts Bar Association announced they were opening a formal investigation into his professional conduct, and several ongoing cases were being reviewed for potential misconduct. By Wednesday, Morrison, Kessler, and Associates had issued a statement distancing themselves from Richard and placing him on indefinite administrative leave pending the outcome of the bar investigation. His nameplate was removed from the building directory, his parking space was reassigned, and his access cards were deactivated. Richard Morrison's 30-year legal career was over. I felt no satisfaction in his professional destruction, only a profound sense that natural consequences were finally catching up with choices that had been years in the making. The man who had spent 5 years systematically destroying my relationship with my son, who had built his renewed fatherhood on lies and manipulation, was finally facing the reality of what he'd done. But the most important consequence wasn't Richard's professional ruin or social disgrace. It was the transformation I saw in Ethan as the days passed, as he began to remember who he'd been before Richard's influence had shaped him into someone else. The cold, polished young man who had been so embarrassed by my presence at his graduation dinner was gone, replaced by someone warmer, more genuine, more connected to his own authentic values. He started visiting me daily, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to rebuild our relationship and rediscover the person he'd been before Richard had convinced him to be ashamed of his background. He also began making changes in his own life that reflected his renewed understanding of who he was and what mattered to him. He declined a lucrative offer from a prestigious investment firm, a position Richard had arranged through his connections, and instead started researching nonprofit organizations and social justice causes where he could use his business education to make a real difference in people's lives. I want to do work that matters, he explained when he told me about his decision. Work that helps people build something real, not just work that makes wealthy people wealthier while the rest of the world struggles. It was exactly the kind of choice David Chun would have made, the kind of decision that honored both the values I'd tried to instill and the character he'd inherited from his biological father. 2 weeks after the graduation dinner, Ethan and I were having lunch at a small cafe near my apartment when a familiar figure approached our table. Rachel Kim, the journalist who had interviewed me that night, stood beside us with a hopeful expression and what appeared to be a thick folder of documents. Ms. Woods, Mr. Woods, I'm sorry to interrupt your meal, but I wanted to thank you for the story you've given our city. The response to our coverage has been unprecedented. What kind of response? Ethan asked, setting down his sandwich. We've received hundreds of letters from readers sharing their own experiences with parental alienation, family manipulation, and the struggle to reconnect with estranged loved ones. Your story has inspired people to reach out to family members they'd lost touch with, to question relationships that might be built on manipulation rather than genuine love. She opened the folder and showed us a sampling of the letters, handwritten notes, typed emails, even a few that appeared to have been dictated to someone else because the writers were too elderly or infirm to write themselves. Ms. Woods, you've become something of a symbol for parents who've been systematically erased from their children's lives. People are calling you courageous, inspirational, a woman who refused to accept injustice even when fighting it seemed hopeless. I felt uncomfortable with the attention, but I understood why the story had resonated with so many people. Family manipulation was more common than most people realized, and Richard's techniques, the gradual erosion of relationships, the rewriting of history, the substitution of material benefits for emotional connection, were employed by manipulative family members everywhere. "I just wanted my son back," I said simply. "And you got him back through patience, planning, and an absolute refusal to give up on love." That's a powerful message for a lot of people who are struggling with similar situations. After Rachel left, Ethan reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just 2 weeks earlier. "Are you okay with all the attention? I know this isn't what you wanted when you planned the video." "I'm okay with it," I said, "because it's helping other people. If our story can inspire one parent to keep fighting for their child, or help one young person recognize when they're being manipulated, then the attention is worth it." What about Richard? Any regrets about how completely his life has been destroyed? I considered the question carefully. Richard Morrison was facing professional ruin, social ostracism, financial devastation, and the complete collapse of the life he'd built on lies and manipulation. "I regret that it came to this," I said finally. "I regret that he chose manipulation over honesty, theft over earning what he wanted legitimately. I regret that he put you through 5 years of confusion and pain. But do I regret that he's finally facing consequences for his actions?
No.
Some people only learn when they lose everything. And if he tries to come back, tries to rebuild, make amends, convince me to give him another chance, then he'll have to live with the truth of what he did, just like we're all living with the truth now. The difference is that our truth is based on love and sacrifice and genuine accomplishment. His truth is based on lies and theft and the systematic destruction of authentic relationships." I squeezed Ethan's hand, feeling the strength and warmth that had always been there beneath Richard's manipulation. "You're free now, sweetheart. Free to be the man you were always meant to be, without anyone trying to reshape you in their image or convince you to be ashamed of where you came from. Free to be the son of Catherine Woods and David Chen. Free to be yourself." 3 weeks after the graduation dinner, I received a call that brought the situation full circle in a way I hadn't expected. It was Amanda Morrison, Richard's soon-to-be ex-wife, asking if she could meet with me privately. We met at a small restaurant in Cambridge, far from the Boston social circles where Amanda was probably persona non grata by now. She looked older than she had at the dinner, her perfectly styled appearance replaced by something more natural, but also more fragile. "Catherine," she said as we settled into a quiet corner booth, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." "You don't owe me anything, Amanda." "Yes, I do. I knew. Not all of it, but I knew enough to understand that Richard's relationship with Ethan wasn't what he presented it to be." She paused, clearly struggling with the admission. "When Richard and I got married, he told me he had a son from a previous relationship, but that the mother was difficult and had made it impossible for him to maintain contact. He said it was a painful situation that he preferred not to discuss." "Did you believe him?" I wanted to believe him. It was easier than asking uncomfortable questions about why a successful attorney would allow himself to be completely cut off from his child for 18 years. Amanda twisted her wedding ring, which she was still wearing, I noticed, and continued. "When Ethan came back into our lives, I was happy for Richard. He seemed genuinely excited about building a relationship with his son, and Ethan was everything you'd want in a stepson. intelligent, accomplished, respectful. But sometimes I would catch Richard coaching him, not about school or career advice, but about perspective, about how to view his childhood, his relationship with you, his own memories. She looked directly at me for the first time since we'd sat down. Richard would tell him things like, "You have to understand, your mother was very young and overwhelmed when you were growing up. She probably made a lot of decisions based on emotion rather than logic." Or, "It's natural for children to idealize their primary caregiver, but as an adult, you can see the situation more objectively." I felt my jaw clench, but I remained silent. I told myself it was just a father helping his son process a complicated childhood. But deep down, I knew he was systematically undermining Ethan's relationship with you. "Why didn't you say anything?" Amanda's laugh was bitter and self-aware. "Because I was complicit. Because having Ethan in our lives made Richard happy, and a happy Richard was easier to live with. Because I enjoyed being seen as the supportive stepmother to a Harvard graduate. Because I was selfish." She paused, then added quietly, "And because I was afraid of what I might find if I looked too closely at the man I'd married." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the implications of her confession. "What will you do now?" I asked. "Divorce him, obviously. My attorney says I have grounds to claim fraud in the marriage itself, given the extent of his deception about his character and his past." "And after that?" "I don't know. I'm 48 years old, and I'm just now realizing that I've spent the last 15 years married to a man I never really knew. It's humbling." As Amanda prepared to leave, she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you," she said. "Richard doesn't know I have it, and he certainly doesn't know I'm giving it to you." Inside the envelope was a cashier's check for $500,000. "What is this?" Richard used marital assets, money that belonged to both of us, to fund his lifestyle during the years he was rebuilding his relationship with Ethan. Expensive dinners, trips, gifts, even some of the costs associated with Ethan's education. Money that should have been disclosed to me as joint expenses. She stood up to leave, then paused one more time. "I can't undo the damage Richard caused, and I can't make up for my own complicity in his manipulation. But I can make sure you're compensated for some of what he stole from you." "Amanda, I can't accept this." "Yes, you can. And you should. You earned it through 23 years of love and sacrifice that Richard tried to claim credit for. Consider it back pay for services rendered." That evening, I called Ethan to tell him about the meeting and Amanda's unexpected gesture. $500,000, he said, his voice filled with amazement. "What will you do with it?" "I don't know yet. Maybe travel. Maybe finally take that European vacation I've been putting off for 25 years. Maybe invest it so I can retire with some dignity. Maybe," Ethan said carefully, "you could use some of it to help other families going through what we went through." "What do you mean?" "I've been doing research on parental alienation, on the support systems available for families dealing with manipulation and estrangement. There isn't much out there, Mom. Most parents in your situation just give up because they don't know how to fight back or they can't afford the kind of long-term strategic planning you were able to do." I could hear the excitement building in his voice as he spoke. "What if we could create something? A foundation or organization that helps other families navigate these situations, that provides resources and support and maybe even funding for people who need professional help to document manipulation or gather evidence." It was a beautiful idea, and one that would honor both our suffering and our victory in a way that could help prevent other families from going through what we'd experienced. "Tell me more," I said. "I'm still thinking it through, but imagine if we could combine your experience and strategic thinking with my business education and research skills. We could create something that would make a real difference in people's lives. Using our pain to help others heal. Using our strength to help others find their own strength." As we talked late into the night, I realized that Richard's manipulation had inadvertently given us something valuable, a deep understanding of how psychological warfare works within families and the skills needed to combat it. He'd tried to steal my son from me, but in the end, he'd given us both a mission that would define the rest of our lives. It was a kind of justice I'd never imagined, but it was perfect in its own way. 6 months after the graduation dinner that changed everything, Ethan and I were sitting in a lawyer's office downtown, signing papers that would formalize what had already become reality in our hearts. Ethan was legally changing his name from Ethan Richard Woods to Ethan David Woods, honoring the father he'd never known while severing his last connection to the man who had manipulated and abandoned him. The process had been Ethan's idea, part of his journey to reclaim his authentic identity and build a life based on truth rather than the lies Richard had fed him for 5 years. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" I asked as we reviewed the final documents. "This will affect your Harvard degree, your professional network, potentially your future career prospects. Some people might see it as an overreaction." Ethan looked up from the papers with eyes that were clear and certain, more confident than I'd seen him since before Richard's return to our lives. "Mom, I've spent 6 months working with people who judge success by impact rather than income, who measure worth by character rather than connections. I'm more sure of this decision than I've been of anything in my life." His work with Community Building Partners, a nonprofit that provided microfinance loans and business education to underserved communities, had been transformative for him. Instead of using his Harvard MBA to make wealthy investors wealthier, he was helping immigrant families start small businesses, providing financial literacy education to single mothers, and building something that honored both his education and the values I'd tried to instill in him. "Besides," he continued with a smile that reminded me powerfully of the idealistic boy he'd once been, "I want my children to know they're descended from Catherine Woods and David Chin, not from Richard Morrison. Those are the legacies worth inheriting." The mention of future children caught me off guard, sending a flutter of joy and anticipation through my chest. "Children?" I asked with a raised eyebrow and a teasing smile. Ethan's cheeks flushed slightly, and he looked down at the papers with suddenly intense concentration. "Well, hypothetical children.
Someday.
Maybe. If I'm lucky enough to find someone who shares my values and wants to build something meaningful together." "Ethan David Woods," I said, using his full name the way I had when he was a child, and I suspected he was hiding something from me. "Is there something you're not telling me?" "There might be someone," he admitted, his voice taking on the shy, excited tone I remembered from his teenage years when he'd had crushes on classmates. "Her name is Sophia Martinez. She's a social worker I met through my work at Community Building Partners." "Tell me about her." "She's amazing, Mom. She's smart without being condescending, passionate about her work without being preachy, and she has this way of seeing the best in people even when they can't see it themselves." Ethan's face lit up as he talked about Sophia, and I felt my heart expand with happiness for him. "She works with families who've been separated by immigration issues, helping parents and children reunite and rebuild their relationships after years of forced separation. She's seen what manipulation and trauma can do to family bonds, so she understands what we went through better than most people would." "She sounds wonderful. I'd like to meet her." "I was hoping you'd say that. Are you free for dinner Saturday evening? I thought I could cook for both of you at my apartment." I laughed, remembering the many culinary disasters that had resulted from Ethan's attempts at cooking during his teenage years. "Should I bring takeout menus as backup?" "Hey, I've learned a lot in the past few years," he protested with mock indignation. "Living on my own, having to fend for myself without Richard's housekeeper and personal chef, it taught me some basic life skills, including the skill of ordering good takeout from expensive restaurants, including the skill of making a decent lasagna from scratch. Thank you very much." Saturday evening found me standing outside Ethan's apartment building in Cambridge, holding a bottle of wine and feeling nervous in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I was about to meet the woman who might become my daughter-in-law, and I wanted desperately for her to like me, to understand the journey Ethan and I had been on, to accept me as part of whatever family they might build together. Ethan opened the door wearing an apron that read, "Kiss the Cook," and looking more relaxed and happy than I'd seen him since childhood. His apartment was small but tastefully furnished, with books and artwork that reflected his interests rather than the expensive but impersonal decorator touches that had characterized his living spaces during his years under Richard's influence. "Mom, perfect timing," he said, embracing me warmly. "Sophia just arrived, and dinner's almost ready." He led me into his small dining room, where a young woman was arranging flowers in a simple glass vase. She was pretty in an understated way, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and warm brown eyes that radiated intelligence and compassion. She wore a simple dress and minimal makeup, but there was something about her presence that suggested inner strength and genuine confidence. "Sophia, this is my mother, Catherine Woods." Sophia stepped forward with her hand extended and a smile that seemed genuine rather than polite. "Ms. Woods, it's such an honor to meet you. Ethan has told me so much about you, about everything you've been through together. I feel like I already know you. Please call me Catherine. And the honor is mine. Ethan speaks of you constantly. I was beginning to think you might be too good to be true." Over dinner, which was, to my amazement, actually a quite delicious homemade lasagna accompanied by garlic bread and a fresh salad, I found myself completely charmed by Sophia Martinez. She was intelligent without being pretentious, passionate about her work without being self-righteous, and clearly devoted to my son in a way that reminded me of healthy love rather than the manipulation and control that had characterized Richard's relationships. Ethan told me about the video, Sophia said as we cleared the dishes and moved to the living room for coffee. "About how you exposed what Richard had been doing to your family. That took incredible courage and patience." "It took incredible patience," I corrected. "The courage was Ethan's, in choosing to face the truth even when it was painful and disorienting. I work with families destroyed by manipulation all the time," Sophia continued, settling onto the couch beside Ethan with natural ease. "Immigration authorities, abusive ex-partners, even well-meaning relatives who think they know what's best. There are so many ways that authentic family relationships can be damaged or destroyed by outside interference." She paused, looking between Ethan and me with something that might have been admiration. "Most families never recover from that kind of systematic alienation. The fact that you two found your way back to each other, that you were able to rebuild trust and love after years of manipulation, it gives me hope for the families I work with every day." As the evening progressed, I watched the easy interaction between Ethan and Sophia, the way they finished each other's sentences and shared private jokes, the way their hands found each other without conscious thought. But more importantly, I saw how Sophia brought out the best in my son, his humor, his compassion, his natural warmth that Richard had tried so hard to suppress. Where Richard had encouraged Ethan to see relationships as transactional, Sophia helped him understand that love was about mutual support and genuine care. Where Richard had pushed him to view his background as something to overcome or hide, Sophia celebrated the strength and character his upbringing had given him. "Mom," Ethan said as we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, "there's something I want to tell you. Something I should have shared months ago." I felt a flutter of nervousness, wondering what new revelation was coming. "I've been seeing a therapist, Dr. Patricia Hernandez. She specializes in helping people recover from emotional manipulation and family trauma." "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful. How has it been?" "Difficult, but necessary," Ethan replied honestly. "She's helped me understand how thoroughly Richard rewired my thinking, how he convinced me that my love for you was weakness rather than strength, that gratitude was a burden rather than a virtue. Sophia reached over and took his hand, offering silent support and encouragement. One of the things we've worked on is understanding the difference between earned relationship and bought relationship. Richard bought his way into my life with opportunities and connections and material benefits. But you earned your place in my life through 23 years of love and sacrifice and unwavering support. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes as I listened to my son articulate truths that I'd always hoped he would understand but had feared he might never remember.
Dr.
Hernandez says that people who've experienced parental alienation often struggle with trust and attachment for years afterward. But she also says that having one secure, loving relationship as a foundation can help heal all the other damage. He looked directly at me, his eyes serious and grateful and full of the love that had been buried but never truly destroyed. You were that foundation for me, Mom. Even when I couldn't see it, even when Richard convinced me to reject it, that foundation was still there. And it's what's allowing me to build something real with Sophia, something based on genuine love rather than manipulation or transaction. Ethan, Sophia said softly, her voice carrying a hint of excitement, this is probably the perfect time. My son's face broke into a grin that could have powered the entire city, and he reached into his pocket to pull out a small velvet box. Mom, I wanted you to be the first to know. Sophia and I are engaged. He opened the box to reveal a simple but beautiful diamond ring, not the ostentatious display that Richard would have encouraged, but something elegant and meaningful that spoke of genuine love rather than showmanship. I asked Sophia to marry me last week, but we wanted to tell you together. We wanted you to be part of this from the very beginning because family, real family, authentic family, is the most important thing we have. I looked at these two young people, so clearly in love, so committed to building something authentic and lasting, and felt my heart overflow with joy and gratitude. When's the wedding? I asked through happy tears. Next spring, Sophia said, her face glowing with excitement. We want a small ceremony, just family and close friends. We want it to be about love and commitment and the people who matter most to us, not about spectacle or social status. And Mom, Ethan added, his voice taking on a tone of deep sincerity, I want you to walk me down the aisle. I know that's not traditional, but you're the parent who raised me, who shaped my character, who deserves to be honored at my wedding. I couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the generosity and love in the gesture. Are you sure? I finally managed. It's your day. You should do whatever feels right to you, whatever would make you happiest. This feels right, he said firmly. Walking down the aisle with the woman who made me possible, toward the woman who makes me whole. It's exactly how I want to start my marriage. The contrast with Richard's influence couldn't have been more stark. Where Richard had encouraged Ethan to see family relationships as obligations to be managed, Sophia helped him understand that they were sources of strength to be celebrated. Where Richard had pushed him to distance himself from his past, Sophia inspired him to honor the experiences that had shaped his character. As we sat together planning their wedding, discussing guest lists and venues and flowers, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete, uncomplicated happiness. My son was home, really home, not just physically but emotionally and spiritually. He'd found a partner who valued the same things I'd tried to teach him, and I was being included in their joy rather than hidden from it. There's one more thing, Ethan said as the evening wound down and Sophia excused herself to call her own parents with the engagement news. Sophia and I have been talking about the future, about the kind of life we want to build together after we're married. What kind of life is that? We want to expand the work we're both doing with vulnerable families. Maybe start our own organization focused specifically on helping families heal from manipulation and alienation. Sophia's clinical experience with trauma, recovery combined with my business background, and our personal experience with family manipulation, we think we could really make a difference. Using your Harvard MBA to help families rather than corporations. Using everything I've learned from Harvard, from Richard's manipulation, from your example of resilience and strategic thinking, to prevent other families from going through what we went through. I looked at my son, this remarkable young man who had transformed pain into purpose, who had chosen service over status, who had found his way back to the values I'd tried to instill in him despite 5 years of systematic brainwashing. "I think that sounds perfect," I said. "And I think your father, your real father, David Chun, would be incredibly proud of the man you've become." "I hope so," Ethan said quietly. "I try to live up to both his memory and your example every single day." As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The pain of Richard's manipulation, the years of distance and hurt and confusion, the careful planning that had led to the graduation dinner revelation, all of it had been worth it to see my son reclaim his authentic self and build a life based on love rather than lies. Richard Morrison had spent 5 years trying to remake Ethan in his own image, to turn him into another version of himself, calculating, status-obsessed, willing to discard inconvenient relationships in pursuit of success and social advancement. But in the end, character had triumphed over manipulation, love had conquered lies, and the boy I'd raised had found his way back to being the man I'd always known he could become. Tomorrow, I would start planning my son's wedding. Not as an embarrassing obligation to be hidden in the back of the room, but as the honored parent walking him toward his future. It was the sweetest victory I could have imagined. The wedding took place on a perfect morning in May at the Boston Public Garden, surrounded by blooming tulips and the gentle sounds of the city waking up around us. It was everything Sophia and Ethan had wanted. Intimate, meaningful, focused on love and commitment rather than spectacle or social positioning. I stood at the edge of the small gathering of family and friends, wearing a dress I'd bought specifically for this day, not navy blue this time, but a soft lavender silk that complemented my silver hair and made me feel beautiful rather than invisible. In my hands was a bouquet of white roses that matched the one Sophia would carry, a symbol of the new family we were all becoming together. The guest list was small but carefully chosen, limited to people who genuinely loved and supported Ethan and Sophia rather than those who might provide social or professional advantages.
Dr.
Martinez was there, having become a close friend to both Ethan and me over the past months as we continued our family healing work. Sophia's family, warm, welcoming people who had embraced Ethan completely, filled 2 rows of chairs, their joy and excitement palpable in the spring air. Several colleagues from community building partners had come to celebrate, along with some of the families they'd helped through their nonprofit work. My friend Maria sat in the front row with tears of joy already streaming down her face, having watched our journey from despair to triumph with the kind of loyalty that only true friendship can provide. Conspicuously absent was anyone from Richard's world. The society connections, the legal establishment elite, the Boston social climbers who had been so important to Ethan during his years under Richard's influence. None of them were here. This wedding was about authentic relationships built on love and respect, not networking opportunities or social advancement. As the string quartet began playing Pachelbel's canon, I took Ethan's arm and felt a profound sense of completion wash over me. My son looked handsome in his simple gray suit, but more importantly, he looked happy, genuinely, deeply happy in a way that had nothing to do with external validation or material success. "Ready?" I asked softly. "I've been ready for this my whole life," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Ready to start a family with someone who loves me for who I really am, ready to honor the people who made this moment possible." We began walking slowly down the short aisle between the chairs, and I felt the eyes of everyone there following us with warmth and approval. This was how it should be. A mother honored for her role in shaping the man who was about to begin his own family, rather than hidden away as an embarrassment to be managed. Halfway down the aisle, Ethan stopped and turned to face me, then addressed the entire gathering in a voice that carried clearly through the quiet garden. "Before we go any further," he said, "I need to say something that should have been said years ago." The guests fell silent, sensing that this was an important moment. 29 years ago, my mother held me in her arms and promised that love would be enough to give me the life I deserved. She kept that promise through poverty and struggle and years of sacrifice that I didn't fully appreciate until recently. I felt tears beginning to flow as he continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. She worked 3 jobs so I could attend good schools. She wore the same clothes for years so I could have what I needed to compete with children from wealthier families. She gave up her own dreams, her own chances at happiness and financial security, so I could pursue mine. He paused, looking directly into my eyes while speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. And when someone tried to steal me from her with lies and manipulation, she fought for me with patience and strategy and an absolute refusal to give up on the love between a mother and her child. The small gathering erupted in spontaneous applause, and I saw that half the guests were crying along with me. I am the man I am today because of her love, her strength, and her unwavering belief in who I could become, Ethan continued when the applause died down. Walking down this aisle with her isn't just tradition, it's the most important moment of my life, because it's my chance to publicly honor the woman who made everything else possible. He turned to address the audience one more time. My mother taught me that family isn't just about blood or genetics or legal documents. Family is about the people who fight for you when you can't fight for yourself, who believe in you when you don't believe in yourself, who love you enough to tell you the truth even when it's painful. He looked back. The words rang out across the garden, carrying 29 years of love and sacrifice and absolute certainty that my son had found his perfect partner. The reception was held at a charming restaurant nearby, decorated with local flowers and homemade touches that Sophia's family had created with love rather than hired professionals. It was nothing like the elaborate society events Richard would have insisted on, but it was perfect for the life Ethan and Sophia were building together. Authentic, meaningful, focused on relationships rather than appearances. During the dinner, Ethan stood to give a toast that made everyone in the room reach for their tissues. "A year ago, I was lost," he began, his voice carrying easily through the intimate space. "I'd allowed someone to convince me that success meant abandoning the people who loved me, that advancement required leaving my values behind, that happiness came from external validation rather than internal peace." He looked at Sophia, then at me, his face glowing with love and gratitude. "Today, I'm surrounded by people who love me for who I really am, not for who I might become or what I might achieve. I'm married to a woman who makes me want to be the best version of myself, not a different version of myself. And I'm standing here with the full support and blessing of the mother who taught me that real strength comes from lifting others up, not from stepping on them to reach higher ground." He raised his glass to me, and his voice grew stronger with conviction. "To Catherine Woods, who proved that love is stronger than manipulation, truth is more powerful than lies, and family is worth fighting for no matter how long it takes or how difficult the battle becomes." The toast was echoed by everyone in the room, and I felt a warmth that went deeper than pride or satisfaction. This was vindication. Not just of my choices as a mother, but of my belief that authentic love would ultimately triumph over calculated manipulation. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Sophia approached me with a small wrapped package. "Catherine, this is for you. From both of us, with all our love." I opened it to find a framed photograph from the wedding, the moment when Ethan and I were walking down the aisle together, both of us beaming with joy and pride. But what caught my attention was the inscription Sophia had written on the mat surrounding the photo. To Catherine Woods, who showed us that the strongest families are built on love, sacrifice, and an absolute refusal to give up on each other. Thank you for raising the man of my dreams and for welcoming me into your family with open arms. With love and gratitude, Sophia. Below that, Ethan had added his own message in his familiar handwriting. Mom, this photo captures the moment when everything came full circle. Thank you for fighting for us when I didn't know we needed fighting for. Thank you for showing me what unconditional love looks like. I love you always. Ethan David Woods. Ethan David Woods. His new legal name, honoring both me and the father he'd never known but whose character lived on in his values and choices. As the evening ended and the newlyweds prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a simple camping trip to Acadia National Park, because they wanted to start their marriage connecting with nature rather than luxury, Ethan called me aside for one final conversation. Mom, I need you to know that none of this would have been possible without what you did at the graduation dinner. Without you having the courage to expose the truth publicly, I might have spent years trying to figure out why I felt so disconnected from myself and my authentic values. You would have figured it out eventually. Your character is too strong to be permanently suppressed by someone else's manipulation. Maybe. But by then, how much damage would have been done? How many years would we have lost? How many opportunities to know each other as the people we really are would have slipped away? He paused, looking out at the garden where we'd celebrated his wedding to a woman who truly understood and valued him. Richard took 5 years from us, but you made sure he couldn't take any more. You gave me back my authentic self, my real family, my understanding of what actually matters in life. And what matters?
Love.
Honesty. The kind of relationships where you're valued for who you are, not what you can provide or achieve. The knowledge that family means people who fight for you, not people who try to reshape you into their image of who you should be. As I drove home that night, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this perfect day. 5 years of distance and pain and systematic manipulation, followed by months of revelation and reconciliation and healing. Richard Morrison's plan had been flawless in its conception. Steal a young man from his mother by convincing him that his background was shameful and his authentic self was insufficient for the life he deserved. Replace love with transaction, family with networking, character with status. But Richard had made one fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated the power of a mother's love and the strength of authentic character. He had assumed that 18 years of foundation could be overwritten by 5 years of manipulation. He had been profoundly, irreversibly wrong. Tonight, my son was beginning his honeymoon as Ethan David Woods, married to a woman who celebrated his values rather than trying to change them, surrounded by people who loved him for exactly who he was rather than who he might become. And Richard Morrison was alone somewhere, facing a future built on the wreckage of his lies and manipulation, his reputation destroyed, his family lost, his carefully constructed life reduced to nothing. The contrast couldn't have been more complete or more satisfying. I had spent 29 years raising my son to be a man of character, compassion, and integrity. Richard had spent 5 years trying to turn him into a mirror image of himself, calculating, manipulative, willing to discard inconvenient relationships in pursuit of advancement. But in the end, love had triumphed over manipulation, truth had conquered lies, and the boy I'd raised had become exactly the man I'd always known he could be. If this story of manipulation, perseverance, and ultimate triumph touched your heart, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of resilience and justice. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had to fight for a relationship that someone else was trying to destroy? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to keep fighting for the people they love. Remember, real love doesn't give up, it just gets stronger. Sometimes the most powerful victories are built on patience, truth, and the unbreakable bond between people who refuse to let others tear them apart. Until next time, keep believing in the power of authentic love.